Picture this. You're floating 400 kilometers above Earth, looking down at the Sahara Desert. Endless sand, rock, nothing but beige emptiness stretching in every direction. And then, right in the middle of Mauritania, you see it. A perfect bullseye, concentric rings one inside the other, spanning nearly 50 kilometers across. It looks like someone took a compass the size of a small country and carved circles into the Earth's crust. Astronauts have used it as a landmark since the earliest space missions. It's called the Richat Structure. Locals call it the Eye of the Sahara, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here's the question that's been quietly driving geologists, archaeologists, and amateur internet sleuths half insane for the better part of 2 decades. Why does this thing look almost exactly like the description of Atlantis that Plato wrote down over 2,300 years ago? We're talking concentric rings of land and water, a central plain, mountains ringing the whole structure like a natural fortress. It's eerily specific. Plato described a city built in rings, alternating bands of earth and sea, with a massive circular plan you could trace from above, if anyone back then could have seen it from above. And now here's a geological formation in the Sahara that matches that layout close enough to make you sit up and squint at the screen. So is this the actual lost city? Did ancient Greeks somehow know about a structure buried in what's now the driest desert on Earth? Or is this one of the greatest cases of humans seeing patterns where none exist, our brains desperately trying to connect a 2,300-year-old myth to a modern satellite photo because the coincidence is just too tempting to ignore? That's what we're digging into today, and I promise you, this rabbit hole goes way deeper than a few circles in the sand. We're going to go back to the original Greek texts and see exactly what Plato claimed, word for word, no exaggeration. We're going to trace how that story travelled from Egypt to Athens, and ask whether it survived the journey intact or got twisted along the way. We're going to look at the actual geology of the Richat Structure, what mainstream science says formed it, and whether that explanation holds up. And we're going to check the archaeological record, because if there was ever a lost civilization out there, it should have left something behind. If you're listening to this while drifting off, that's honestly the best compliment I could ask for. So subscribe, and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all listening to the same mystery at once. And if you want this without any ads breaking up the story, follow along on Spotify. It's free, it's smoother, and if you've got 30 seconds, a 5-star review helps this reach more curious minds like yours. Links in the description. Alright, let's get into it. Because before we can decide whether the Sahara hides a lost city, we need to go back to the source. What did Plato actually write about Atlantis? And more importantly, what did he not say that everyone seems to assume he did? So let's go straight to the source. Not documentaries, not blog posts, not YouTube thumbnails with red arrows pointing at sand. The actual text, Atlantis, comes from exactly 2 places in the historical record. 2 dialogues written by Plato around 360 BC called Timaeus and Critias. That's it. That's the entire ancient foundation for one of the most famous legends in human history. 2 philosophical conversations, and one of them, Critias, breaks off mid-sentence. Unfinished. We don't even get the ending. Here's what's actually in there. A massive circular island, built in alternating rings of land and water, like a target painted onto the ocean floor. A central island holding a temple and a palace. Canals connecting the rings, engineered so ships could sail from the open sea straight into the heart of the city. A vast rectangular plain surrounding the whole structure, bordered by mountains that shielded it from cold northern winds. And ruling over it all, a wealthy, technologically advanced, militarily dominant civilization, that eventually became arrogant enough to anger the gods. Now here's the part everyone skips. Plato wasn't writing history. He was writing philosophy. Timaeus and Critias are conversations about the nature of the universe, ideal societies and moral decay. Atlantis shows up specifically as a cautionary tale, a hypothetical perfect civilization that collapses because of its own hubris. Plato uses it the way we'd use a parable. That doesn't automatically make it false, but it changes what kind of claim we're even evaluating. And then there's the translation problem. The original Greek terms for size, distance, and geography have been interpreted wildly differently by different scholars for centuries. Small shifts in translation can turn a modest island into a continent-sized landmass. So when we ask whether something matches Atlantis, we need a real standard. A vague circle doesn't count. What counts is specific, unlikely to be coincidental correspondence, several independent details lining up together, not just one shape that happens to look round from space. So where did Plato even get this story? He doesn't claim he made it up from scratch. Inside the dialogues, he gives us a kind of origin story for Atlantis, a chain of transmission that sounds impressive on paper, and gets messier the more you look at it. According to Plato, it starts in Egypt. The setup goes like this. Around 600 BC, the Athenian statesman and poet Solon takes a trip to Egypt. He's already famous in Greece, a lawgiver, a reformer, a kind of proto-philosopher. While he's there, Egyptian priests in the city of Sais supposedly tell him an ancient story preserved in their temple records. A story about a primeval Athens, thousands of years older than the one Solon knew, and its war against a mighty island power called Atlantis. The priests in Plato's telling basically roast Solon at first. They say the Greeks are like children. No old traditions, no ancient histories, because their cities keep getting wiped out by floods and fires. Egypt, by contrast, keeps its records. Over and over, they say, civilization rises and falls, and people forget. But the temple scribes write everything down. This move is clever. It gives Plato's story an instant aura of authority. It's not just a rumour, it's not something some guy heard from his uncle. It's in the Egyptian archives, endorsed by the oldest, wisest civilization Greeks like to name drop. If you want your myth to sound like history, that's exactly how you frame it. From there, the chain goes. Egyptian priests tell Solon. Solon decides this story is too good to waste. He starts turning it into a long epic poem, like a Greek Iliad about Atlantis and primeval Athens. But he never finishes it. He dies first. Then, according to Plato, Solon passes the story to a relative. That relative passes it down again. Eventually it reaches Plato's own grandfather, Critias the elder. He tells it to Plato's cousin, Critias the younger. And Critias the younger, now an old man, recounts it to Socrates and friends in the dialogue. Egyptian priests Solon, several generations of family storytelling. Plato. That's at least 200 years of oral and semi-oral transmission before it ever hits the page. And that's if you take the chain at face value. Now humans are good at telling stories. We're less good at keeping them pristine over centuries. Every retelling introduces tiny edits. A detail forgotten here, a flourish added there, a number rounded up because it sounds more impressive. And Plato is not a neutral tape recorder at the end of this chain. He is a professional myth builder, philosopher, and rhetorical engineer. By the time the story gets to him, we're probably not dealing with a frozen block of historical fact. We're looking at something more organic, a narrative that's been passed around family gatherings, polished, dramatized, updated to fit new political realities. Picture a family legend about a heroic ancestor. Over generations, the battles get bigger. The speeches get longer. The moral gets clearer. The basic outline might still be rooted in something real, but the edges blur. Now layer Plato's agenda on top. He's writing at a moment when Athens has very specific ideological needs. It has just lived through the Persian Wars, the rise and fall of its own empire, internal civil conflict, and the humiliation of losing the Peloponnesian War. In that context, virtuous ancient Athens defeats arrogant superpower from across the sea isn't just a cool plot. Its political messaging, Atlantis, in the dialogues, functions as a mirror for imperial Athens. Rich, technologically advanced, powerful, and ultimately ruined by moral decay. The contrast is sharp. Humble, orderly Athens versus decadent, overreaching Atlantis. That's not accidentally convenient, that's what philosophers call exemplum, a constructed example meant to teach a lesson. Does that mean Plato invented Atlantis out of thin air? Not necessarily, but it does mean that every detail we read has passed through multiple filters. First, the memory and worldview of Egyptian priests, interpreting their own records and myths. Then Solon's understanding, translation, and poetic shaping. He thinks in Greek categories: city-states, heroes, epic wars. He's going to fit what he hears into frames his audience understands. Then a couple of generations of family tradition, where the story survives not because it's perfectly accurate, but because it's good enough to remember and fun enough to repeat. Then Plato, who turns it into a philosophical narrative with deliberate moral architecture. He has every incentive to dial up the grandeur, the antiquity, the symbolism. You can see this tension most clearly in the numbers. The famous 9,000 years line. The Egyptian priest in Timaeus tells Solon that the war between Athens and Atlantis happened 9,000 years before Solon's time. If you take that literally, you end up somewhere around 9,600 BC. That's full-on late Ice Age, long before classical-style stone temples, triremes, and big bronze armies are supposed to exist. So what do people do with that? Option 1, take it literally. This is where some Atlantis hunters place a lost civilization deep in prehistory. If that's the case, then either our timeline of technological development is radically wrong, or Plato's description has pasted classical Greek tech and politics onto something much older. Option 2, argue mistranslation. Some researchers point out that the Greek word etos can mean year, but that Egyptians used different time units, like lunar months or seasonal cycles. If 9,000 years really meant 9,000 months, you're suddenly in a much more conventional historical window, closer to the early Bronze Age. Others suggest errors moving from Egyptian numerals to Greek, or even that a scribe added a 0 too many. Option 3. Treat the number as rhetorical. In Greek literature, gigantic timespans often serve as a marker of mythical antiquity, not as a precise dating system. 9,000 years ago in this context might function like in the age before memory, not on April 3rd, 9,621 BC. Each option says something different about what kind of story we're dealing with. Literal chronology suggests a lost chapter of human history. Calendar confusion suggests a garbled but possibly historical memory. Rhetorical hyperbole suggests a moral tale dressed in historical costume. And then there's the bias baked into who wins. In Plato's version, it's the ancestors of Athens who stand alone against a global empire and save the entire Mediterranean from conquest. The noble small state versus the decadent superpower. If you've heard modern nations tell stories about their own origins, this should feel familiar. These are the kinds of narratives societies love: chosen people, righteous underdogs, cosmic validation of their values. That doesn't automatically kill the story. National epics often wrap kernels of real conflict in layers of symbolism. The Trojan War might be remembered as 10 years of gods meddling and heroes dueling, but archaeological Troy was a real place with real walls that burned in real fires. Memory distorts, but it doesn't always hallucinate from scratch. So when we look at Atlantis through this chain, Egyptian record, Greek statesman, family legend, philosophical dialogue, we should expect at least 3 layers. A potential historical or environmental kernel, maybe a flood, a coastal power, a devastating war, or the sudden collapse of a rich maritime culture. A political and cultural overlay, Athens cast as eternal defender of order, Atlantis as the archetype of overreaching power, and a philosophical polishing, details sharpened, numbers inflated, geography simplified, so the story hits harder as a warning about hubris. The real question isn't, did Plato tell the truth, yes or no? It's, if there was some real event or place underneath all this storytelling, what parts of that could plausibly survive the journey? What would be robust enough to make it through priests, poets, families and philosophers, with its basic outlines still intact? To answer that, we need something concrete to compare. A candidate in the real world that shares enough specific, unlikely details with Plato's description that coincidence starts to look less likely. Which brings us to the middle of the Sahara. A gigantic circular structure the size of a small country, built in concentric rings, sitting in a place that today looks like the last spot on Earth anyone would put a maritime superpower. If you could zoom out right now, straight up from North Africa, until the whole Sahara fits under you like a map, your eyes would go to one place almost instantly. Not the Nile, not the Mediterranean coast, not the green strip along West Africa. There's a bullseye in the middle of the desert. It's called the Richat Structure. Locals sometimes just call it Guelba Richat, the Richat Dome. On satellite images, it looks so clean, so geometric, that the first astronauts who saw it from orbit used it as a landmark, a kind of cosmic road sign. You are here, above planet Earth. Let's put it on the map before we get lost in the weirdness. You're in Mauritania, in northwest Africa. Not Morocco, not Algeria. Below them, tucked against the Atlantic, but far enough inland that you're deep in the Sahara's interior. The Richat Structure sits on the Adrar Plateau, a high, rocky tableland that rises out of the sand. Think dry plateaus, eroded mesas, endless stone, one of the most remote, least populated regions on Earth. The nearest coast is hundreds of kilometres to the west. The nearest big modern city is a distant thing, a dot on a map connected by fragile roads that can disappear under dunes. This is not beachfront property. It's one of those places where, if your vehicle dies, you might actually die with it. Now, once you're up there, looking down from the perspective of a satellite or an astronaut, the chaos of dunes and rock breaks, and you see order. The Richat Structure is roughly circular. Not a rough blob, not a random patch, but a series of nested rings, like someone dropped a pebble in ancient stone and froze the ripple pattern. The outer edge is about 40 to 45 kilometres across. That's 25 to 28 miles in diameter. You could drop an entire major city into it and still have room to spare. It's not a circle in the sand. It's more like a small country with a bullseye stamped into its surface. Those rings aren't perfectly smooth like a graphic designer's vector circle. They're broken, eroded, chewed up by time. Ridges arc around in half-moons, then fade, then pick up again. Some look like horseshoe-shaped walls, others like terraces. In satellite imagery, different rock layers weather into slightly different colours, pale, reddish, brown, almost bluish in some processed views, so the circles pop even more. Your brain, which is wired to detect patterns and symmetry, can't not see design. That's where the trouble starts. Your mind starts asking the obvious questions. Why is this so round? Why so many rings? Why here, in the middle of nowhere? And if you've ever read Plato's description of Atlantis, rings of land and water surrounding a central island, it's hard not to feel a flicker of recognition, a click of, wait a second, the erosion patterns make it worse in the best possible way. Over millions of years, wind and water have carved the Richat into a series of raised ridges and depressed basins. From above, it can look like alternating bands, high, low, like streets and canals. Some channels cut through the rings, like gateways or causeways. The whole thing has a kind of ruined look, as if once upon a time it was sharper, cleaner, built, and now you're just looking at the skeleton. To a modern geologist, those patterns say layered rocks of different hardness, exposed and weathered. To a pattern-hungry human who wants stories, they whisper something else. City plan, fortifications, concentric districts. Add the name Eye of the Sahara, which people started using because from space it looks exactly like a staring eye, and the human-made speculation practically writes itself. Eyes imply watching, design, purpose. Bullseyes imply targets, intentions. Cities love circles, walls, moats, ring roads. Our brains drag all those associations into this one giant, circular scar. So is it a city, according to the scientific consensus? No, or at least not in any sense of built from scratch by humans. Geologists put the Richat firmly in the category of geological formation, not human architecture. At a high level, the story they tell is this. Imagine ancient layers of rock bulging upward, forming a dome. Over time, erosion shaves off the top and cuts down through the layers. Different rock types weather at different rates. Softer layers get carved out. Harder ones stand up as ridges. Slice through a layered dome and wear it away long enough. And from above, you don't see a dome, you see rings. In that view, the Richat structure isn't a plan. It's a cross-section. Not a blueprint, but a wound revealing the internal anatomy of the crust. That doesn't stop people from wondering. Because even if you fully accept the geology, uplift, erosion, differential weathering, you're still left with this uncomfortable coincidence. A giant, multi-ringed, nearly circular feature, conveniently close to the Atlantic, in a region that might not always have been a dead desert, and an ancient story about a multi-ringed circular city of a powerful maritime culture. The reason the Richat structure became the internet's favourite Atlantis candidate isn't that it's mysterious in some basic scientists' are baffled sense. It's that, visually, it's almost too on the nose. If you handed a concept artist the Timaeus and Critias and said, "Draw me Atlantis from above," you'd expect something that looks uncannily like a desanded, re-flooded Richat. That's the comparison we're headed toward. On one side, a geological dome torn open by erosion. On the other, Plato's carefully structured description of concentric rings of land and sea. Before we can really judge how far that match goes, though, we need to zoom in once more, this time, not with the eyes of myth hunters, but with the toolkit of geology. What exactly is this eye made of? How old are those rings? And does the sober scientific story leave any room at all for an Atlantis hiding in plain sight? If you sit down with a geologist and say, "Okay, forget Atlantis for a second," what is this thing actually? You don't get mystery. You get a pretty specific sequence of events. In the standard model, the Richat structure starts as nothing special at all. Just another stack of sedimentary rocks laid down over hundreds of millions of years. Layer after layer after layer. Shallow seas advance and retreat. Rivers dump sand and silt. Mud settles. Minerals precipitate out. You get limestones, sandstones, shales, maybe some evaporites here and there. Different colours, different hardnesses, all quietly piling up into a more or less horizontal cake of rock. Then something happens underneath. Not a volcano punching through the surface in a huge explosion, but a slower, subtler push from below. Geologists call it doming or uplift. Deep in the crust, heat and tectonic forces cause the rocks to expand or buckle upward. Imagine taking that flat stack of rock layers and gently pressing up from the centre with your thumb. The whole stack arches into a broad dome. That's the first key idea. The Richat is, in essence, the eroded remains of a big, ancient dome. Now, leave your dome sitting there for tens of millions of years while nature goes to work with the most patient sandblaster imaginable. Rain falls, streams form, wind howls, every droplet and every grain of sand is a tiny chisel. Erosion starts shaving off the top of the dome, then cutting down into its interior. But it doesn't cut everything equally. This is where differential erosion comes in. Those sedimentary layers aren't all built the same. Some are tough, cemented sandstones that resist weathering. Others are softer shales or friable limestones that crumble more easily. When erosion eats into the dome, the soft layers are hollowed out faster, turning into low valleys or depressions. The hard layers hang on longer and stand up as ridges. So what are the rings you see from space? They're not walls. They're not embankments. They're cross-sections of those rock layers, the edges of the strata where the once flat beds have been arched up, sliced by erosion, and left sticking out like the growth rings of a tree that's been cut from above. Picture an onion. Slice a big dome-shaped chunk off the top. If you look down at that cut surface, you see curved bands where each layer reaches the surface. Now imagine that some of those bands are made of tougher material and stick up higher, and some are weaker and get scooped out into troughs. From the sky, that's the Richat, the exposed, weathered edges of an old onion of rock. This is why geologists talk about strata boundaries when they describe the eye. When people online trace those circular ridges and say, "Look, that's a wall," the geological answer is, no, that's where one rock unit ends and the next begins. Now, what about volcanoes? If you search around, you'll see claims that the Richat is a volcanic caldera, or that it shows evidence of some catastrophic explosion, or that it's a hydrothermal complex like Yellowstone gone sideways. There is a kernel of truth buried in there, but it's not quite what the sensational versions suggest. The rocks making up most of the visible rings are sedimentary. They're not solidified lava flows forming a classic volcanic cone. When geologists map and sample them, they find limestones, sandstones, and other typical sedimentary units that formed in water, not in magma chambers. That alone rules out the idea that the whole structure is just one big volcanic crater. However, there is volcanic and hydrothermal activity in the story. Within and around the dome, geologists have found intrusive igneous rocks, places where magma forced itself up into cracks but didn't necessarily erupt at the surface. There are also signs that hot fluids once circulated through parts of the dome, altering the surrounding rocks. That's what people mean when they talk about hydrothermal activity, hot water saturated with minerals moving through fractures, changing the chemistry and texture of the host rock. Some researchers have suggested that this combination uplift, intrusions, hydrothermal alteration might have helped weaken certain layers and contributed to the dome's eventual collapse and erosion, maybe even giving extra emphasis to the circular pattern. Others keep it simpler and see the volcanism as a sideshow, interesting, but not the primary sculptor of the rings. Either way, the presence of igneous rocks and hydrothermal minerals doesn't turn the Richat into a giant smoking volcano. It just shows that the crust here has had a busy history. Heat moved through it, fluids moved through it. The dome was not a quiet, untouched bubble. It was part of a complex tectonic environment. The part that tends to blow people's minds is how something this big, and this geometrically neat can come out of such messy, slow processes. But geometry is what you get when you combine large scales with uniform forces. A dome is, by definition, roughly circular in plan. Erosion, acting from above, tends to strip away rock in broad sweeping patterns that follow elevation and rock type. If your rock layers were laid down in wide, laterally continuous sheets, and in many sedimentary basins they were, then when you arch them up and slice them, the outcrops will naturally trace big arcs, even full circles if enough of the dome is preserved. You don't need a planner with a compass, you just need time, gravity, and rocks that respond differently to being chewed on. On small scales, erosion looks chaotic, little gullies and random cracks. On scales of tens of kilometers, underlying structure dominates. The 40-kilometer bullseye is simply the internal architecture of the crust writ large. So how confident is geology about this story? On the basics, very. The rocks have been dated. Their types and sequences match what you'd expect from normal sedimentary deposition. The dome and erosion model fits not just the shape from space, but the way the layers dip on the ground when you actually walk the outcrops. You can stand on one ring, measure the angle of the bedding, follow it around, and watch it behave exactly like a warped, eroded stack of strata. Where things get fuzzier is in the fine print. Exactly what caused the initial uplift. How much did deep tectonics versus shallow processes matter? How important were those intrusive magmas and hydrothermal fluids in weakening or modifying the structure? Did the dome rise in one main pulse or in stages over a long period? These are the kinds of questions that still show up in papers and conferences. But none of those open questions point toward hidden city. They're about refining the mechanics, not throwing out the whole category. From a geological standpoint, the Eye of the Sahara is a spectacular, unusually exposed example of something we know can happen. Layers of rock being bulged upward and then carved down until their internal rings show. It's weird in scale and in how cleanly it displays its anatomy, not in the sense of we have no idea how this could exist, which leaves us in an awkward but fascinating place. The more you understand the geology, the less you need Atlantis to explain the shape. But that doesn't make the resemblance go away. The rings are still there. The bullseye is still staring back. The question becomes less, could this be natural? And more, given that it is natural, how far does the match with Plato's story really go? To answer that, we have to put the geological cross-sections side by side with the ancient text and see where exactly the circles line up and where they stubbornly refuse to. So let's actually do it. Let's take Plato's blueprint of Atlantis and lay it right over the Eye of the Sahara, ring by ring, and see why people freak out when they compare the two. In the dialogue, the heart of Atlantis isn't the whole island. It's a very specific, very engineered core, a circular island in the middle, surrounded by alternating rings of sea and land, 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land between them, then a broad outer moat or ditch beyond that. Everything laid out concentrically, with bridges and causeways cutting across the circles so people and carts could move in and out. When you read that, then look at an overhead image of the Richat structure. The first impression is almost unsettling. You see a central zone. You see rings. You see broad circular bands separated by lower, flatter depressions. The whole thing is roughly round, with a kind of bullseye in the middle. If you're primed with Atlantis already in your head, your brain doesn't say, ah yes, a textbook example of an eroded structural dome. It says, that looks like exactly what Plato described. Start with the basic layout. In Plato, the innermost part is a small central island where the first kings lived. Around it, a narrow ring of water. Outside that, a ring of land, then another, wider water ring, then another land ring, then finally a huge outer water ditch that connects to the sea. At Richat, you have a central uplifted zone of rock, not very circular up close, but surprisingly symmetric from above. Around it are multiple annular ridges and depressions, harder rock standing up as arcs, softer zones scooped out into broad, low troughs. No one carved them, but read as pure geometry. They rhyme with Plato's description: centre, ring, ring, ring. Some Atlantis proponents go further. They count specific rings, trying to align this ridge equals the middle land ring, and that depression equals the inner water ring. They'll highlight the innermost depression as a potential harbour, then point to slightly higher central ground inside it as the island. At the right zoom level, with the right labels, the pattern can look eerily intentional. Then you hit the scale issue. Plato doesn't just say rings, he gives dimensions. Using stadia as his unit, various translations put the central island at around 5-6 kilometres across, the inner water ring at about the same width, the next land ring wider, and so on. Depending on how you interpret the text and the exact length of a stadion, the core complex might span on the order of 20-25 kilometres across, give or take. The Richat structure, by contrast, is big. The main visible bullseye is roughly 40-45 kilometres in diameter. That's at least twice the total width of Plato's ringed city, and maybe more, depending on which reconstruction you use. Defenders of the match have a couple of moves here. One is to say the outermost ring of Richat shouldn't count. You only look at the inner portion. Zoom in on a smaller radius, and the dimensions start to look a bit closer. Another is to argue that ancient measurements might have been mistranslated, exaggerated, or rounded. If the whole story is already admitted to be at least semi-mythical, why assume the stadia are precise? There's also a proportional argument. Even if the absolute sizes don't match, the ratios can look similar. A relatively small central island, then a water-like depression of similar width, then a thicker outer band. To a pattern-hungry brain, that proportional echo can be enough. It doesn't care whether the real-world ring is 4 kilometres or 14. It sees narrow band, then wider band, and locks onto the structure, not the numbers. Then there's the central island piece. Plato is clear, a low hill originally sacred, encircled by a man-made ring of water. At Richat, there is no single perfect round flat-topped mesa in the exact centre that screams palace platform. But the geology does give you complexity in the middle. Higher zones, faulted blocks, outcrops and knobs that stand above the surrounding depressions. Atlantis enthusiasts will take satellite imagery, pick out a particular high-standing block, draw a circle around it, and call that the island. Sometimes they'll overlay Plato's plan. Central island, then first water ring, on top of Richat, rotating it until bridge locations roughly line up with existing breaks in the ridges or drainage channels. Is that mapping rigorous? No. It's interpretive. You have many possible ways to choose your centre and your island. But the human brain is excellent at doing exactly that, sifting a messy landscape until it finds a configuration that matches a mental template. Now think about the water. Plato describes literal sea-filled canals. At Richat, geologists are talking about eroded valleys and resistant ridges. But from a high-altitude view, those eroded troughs trace continuous circular or semicircular paths. They look like ditches, they collect sediment, they sometimes hold temporary water after rare rains. In a more humid past, they could easily have hosted seasonal ponds or marshy stretches. If you're already wondering whether this could have been a lush region instead of a desert, it's a short jump to imagining those troughs as watery rings. Erosion carves out a circular low zone, water naturally pools where the land is low. Centuries later, someone wandering through a semi-arid remnant landscape might see a ring-like depression that used to hold water and describe a ring of water encircling the center. Fast forward again, and a storyteller amps that into a full-on engineered canal system. Even the outermost features invite canal analogies. Plato mentions a massive rectangular ditch dug around the plain, linking the rings to the ocean. Richat doesn't have a neat rectangle, but it does have broad outer depressions and possible ancient drainage pathways leading away from the structure. Connect the dots creatively enough, and you can outline a harbour or access channel with a few strokes of imagination and a forgiving sense of scale. All of this feeds into a deeper psychological engine, pattern matching. Our nervous systems are built to detect structure in chaos. That's what let your ancestors find animal tracks in tangled grass, recognize storm patterns in the sky, and read subtle social cues in a crowd. But the cost of that superpower is false positives. We don't just see meaningful patterns where they exist, we also see them where they don't. Show someone a perfect circular structure in the desert. Tell them an ancient philosopher wrote about a lost circular city destroyed in a cataclysm. Their brain fuses those data streams instantly. It latches on to the overlaps, rings, center, ditches, grand scale, and quietly downplays the mismatches, wrong size, wrong age, wrong geology, wrong location. And once a story template takes hold, everything you see after that tends to reinforce it. A break in a ridge can become a canal entrance. A cluster of rocks on an inner slope can be read as ruins. A natural depression at just the right distance out can become the outer harbour. This doesn't mean the resemblance is meaningless. It explains why the resemblance hits so hard. A huge, ringed dome isn't common. Plato choosing a ringed city as his symbol of peak engineering isn't random. When those two rare things line up in your mind, the emotional reaction, "How can this be a coincidence?" is almost automatic, even if under the hood, the causal link is weak to non-existent. To really evaluate that link, we'll have to ask a tougher question. Even if the rings look right, could this place ever have been watery, let alone coastal, in the way Plato describes? That means turning from circles carved in rock to the history of water in the Sahara itself. To answer that, you have to do something very unintuitive. Take the Sahara, this endless, sun-blasted ocean of sand, and flip the mental picture. Because for most of recent geological history, the Sahara hasn't looked like this. Climate scientists talk about African humid periods, times when Earth's orbit and tilt changed the way sunlight hit the tropics and the whole monsoon system shifted north. When that happens, the rains don't just move a little. They surge. The belt of thunderstorms you see on modern satellite images over Central Africa climbs up into what is now desert. Do that for a few thousand years at a time, and the Sahara transforms. Lake basins fill. Dry wadis turn into real rivers. Grasslands and savannas spread. Hippos, crocodiles, fish and antelope move into places that today look like the surface of Mars. Humans follow the water, and suddenly the world's biggest desert is a patchwork of lakes, swamps and green corridors. We know this didn't just happen once. There were multiple humid windows over the last several 100,000 years. The most recent big one, often called the Green Sahara, peaked between about 11,000 and 5,000 years ago. During that time, satellite imagery and fieldwork show massive paleo lakes across the region, some of them larger than modern European countries. So where does Richat sit in all this? The eye of the Sahara is perched on the Adrar Plateau in Mauritania, a region that, during wetter phases, wasn't just a random patch of sand. It was part of a landscape crisscrossed by ancient river systems flowing toward the Atlantic, dotted with basins where water could pool, and fed by groundwater moving through fractured bedrock. In a humid period, you don't need an ocean to get serious water. Raise rainfall a bit, keep the plateau structure the same, and the low circular depressions around Richat become natural collection bowls. Rain falling on the surrounding highlands drains inward and outward. Troughs fill, marshes form, seasonal lakes appear in the rings. Groundwater rises closer to the surface, feeding springs along faults and fractures. Over centuries, that kind of hydrology leaves fingerprints. Sediment cores from lake beds can show fine, layered mud packed with freshwater diatoms, tiny algae with glass shells and the shells of snails and clams that only live in permanent water. Fossil bones from hippos, crocodiles, fish and amphibians mark former rivers and lakes. Shoreline indicators, wave-cut benches, beach ridges made of rounded pebbles, terraces carved along old water levels, trace the outlines of long-vanished lakes. Pollen grains, preserved in mud, reveal which plants were growing nearby. Grasses, reeds, wetland trees instead of pure desert shrubs across the wider Sahara. Scientists have found all of these. In northern Chad and Niger, Paleolake sediments with fish and crocodile fossils. Around the Libyan desert, ancient shorelines hundreds of kilometers long. In Mauritania and Mali, relict river valleys and lacustrine deposits that don't fit a bone-dry climate. Closer to Richat itself, survey work has turned up evidence of past surface water and wetter conditions in the broader region. Fossil river channels, weathered surfaces that make much more sense under a greener climate, and archaeological sites that cluster around what would have been water sources. It's not as thoroughly mapped as some other Saharan basins, but nothing in the geology suggests Richat has always been the sun-baked, lifeless circle you see today. Now, that's different from saying it was ever, literally, a city surrounded by sea. Plato's Atlantis is described as an island power near the sea with a canal linking the ringed city to the open ocean. If you take that phrase rigidly, Richat faces some obvious problems. It's not on the present coastline. It's more than 400 kilometers from the Atlantic, even under higher sea levels at the end of the last ice age. The ocean would not have marched that far inland. So if you want Richat to be near the sea, you have to loosen what sea means. One option is semantic. Ancient writers often used the same word for large lakes, inland seas and true oceans. The Mediterranean, the Black Sea. Even huge lakes could be spoken of in similar terms. In a green Sahara phase, a really big Paleolake or flooded basin near Richat could have been thought of as a sea by local cultures, then later reinterpreted by Greek audiences as the Atlantis. Another option is narrative drift. Imagine a powerful inland culture dominating a fertile Saharan basin with rivers connecting it to coastal trade networks. Over centuries of retelling, a rich inland power linked to the sea by river routes might morph into an island just beyond the straits on the Atlantic. Geographic memory could compress huge continental interiors into neat coastal settings. You can also think in terms of time stacking. Most of the eye-catching climate evidence we have, those lakes and rivers, is Holocene, the last 10,000–12,000 years. But Richat, as a structure, is far older, on the order of tens of millions of years. That means it sat there through many humid desert cycles we have only fragmentary records for. It could have hosted water-filled depressions in multiple separate windows, long before the particular period some people want to associate with Atlantis. In those windows, plausible scenarios range from a ringed highland with seasonal ponds and marshes in its depressions, feeding local wildlife and small human groups, a more substantial basin landscape, where parts of the Richat troughs held semi-permanent lakes, surrounded by grasslands and used as focal points for Neolithic herders or earlier hunter-gatherers. Connection via rivers and wetlands to much larger lake systems closer to the Atlantic margin, so that travel by water and wetland corridor could conceptually tie the ringed place to a distant sea. None of these turns Richat into a literal maritime harbour complex on the ocean, carved out for triremes. They do, however, make it much easier to imagine people remembering it as a place of water, rings that held ponds or lakes, central high ground looking out over green, a distinctive circular landmark in a temporarily lush world. The paleoclimate story, in other words, doesn't prove Richat was Atlantis. It just knocks down one simple objection. It's in a desert, therefore it could never have been watery. The Sahara hasn't always been the Sahara we know. But Plato's text also anchors Atlantis relative to specific seas and straits. To see how that lines up or doesn't, we have to pull back from rainfall maps and look at the larger geography he describes. So let's zoom out from the local water story and look at Plato's big directional clue. Because buried in a single phrase is the line that almost every Atlantis theory lives or dies on. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles, to a modern ear that sounds straightforward. The Pillars of Heracles are the Strait of Gibraltar. Inside is the Mediterranean, outside is the Atlantic. End of debate, right? Except ancient geography is almost never that clean. By the time of Plato, most Greek writers do seem to use Pillars of Heracles for the narrow strait between southern Spain and northern Morocco. Herodotus, later geographers, and a lot of mythic material tie Heracles' pillars to that western bottleneck, the place where the familiar inland sea opened into the unknown ocean. But even in antiquity, things wobble. Earlier traditions sometimes put Heracles' pillars in completely different places, in the central Mediterranean, near Sicily and Italy, even associated with rocky headlands along other coasts. The hero was a kind of mythic world marker, wherever the edge of the known world happened to be for a particular culture or period. That's where somebody might plant his pillars, and the Greeks' mental map of the world was not frozen in time. It was expanding fast. In Homer's era, the western Mediterranean itself was a kind of misty fringe. By the time of Plato, Phoenician and Carthaginian sailors had been running routes along the Atlantic coasts of Africa and Europe for centuries. They guarded that knowledge jealously. Greek authors heard about these voyages indirectly, in rumours and travellers' tales filtered through multiple languages and power rivalries. So when Plato writes that Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, he's using a phrase that carries myth, changing geography, and political bias all at once. There are a few basic ways people have tried to read that beyond. The first is the strict reading. Beyond means literally outside the Strait of Gibraltar in the open Atlantic. Under that view, Atlantis is somewhere in the Atlantic basin, the Azores, Canary Islands, submerged plateaus, or a now lost mid-ocean landmass, depending on which version you favour. If you lock that meaning in, Richat is immediately in trouble. Mauritania's Atlantic coast is outside the Pillars, but Richat itself sits deep inland, on the African side of the ocean. You have to stretch the idea of an island in front of the strait to get there. Then there's a relative reading. For a Greek audience centred on the Aegean, beyond the Pillars, might simply mean far to the west past the familiar Western Gate, not a precise GPS coordinate outside a razor-thin line on a map. Think of how we casually say something is beyond the horizon when we really just mean way out there. On that looser interpretation, anything in the far western sphere, southern Spain, Morocco, the Atlantic facade of West Africa, could, in storytelling terms, be beyond the Pillars compared to Athens. The phrase becomes directional and rhetorical more than technical. There's also the ugly possibility scholars always have to consider: transmission errors. Plato didn't hand us Atlantis on a stone tablet. The story in Timaeus and Critias comes to us through manuscripts copied and recopied for more than 1,000 years by hand, often by people who had never seen the places described. We know other numerical details in the Atlantis story are almost certainly miscopied or misunderstood, distances, depths, and dates that make little sense as written. If a scribe confused a preposition, or if an earlier oral version used a slightly different geographical tag, the phrase we read as beyond the Pillars of Heracles could be a fossilized version of something more nuanced, near the pillars, toward the pillars, or even before reaching the pillars. A small change in Greek can have a huge ripple in meaning. Add to that the shifting identity of the pillars themselves. Some classical sources hint that for Carthaginians, strategic straits or capes down the Atlantic African coast functioned as de facto gates of the known sea. If Greek writers heard about a powerful western island or coastal power beyond the boundary of Heracles from Phoenician or Punic informants, what exact boundary did they mean? Gibraltar as we define it, or some guarded cape further south along West Africa? Now drop these uncertainties onto a map. Most ancient maps that survive, or that we can reconstruct from texts, are Mediterranean-centric. Greece sits in the mental middle. The further you go from the Aegean, the fuzzier the outlines, the more monsters and vague descriptors like Ethiopians or Libyans fill the space. West Africa's Atlantic coast is almost a blank in Greek geographic writing of Plato's time. There are hints of sailings down the ocean, stories of rivers of strange colour, reports of lands where the sun feels different. But these are patchy, layered, and often second or third hand. If you centre a map on the Mediterranean, a power-controlling territory along the Atlantic-facing bulge of Africa, with inland basins stretching toward the desert interior, could easily be compressed in memory into a great island beyond the Western Strait. Coastlines blur together. Inland seas and coastal inlets merge in the imagination. What was actually a peninsula or a coastal plain, bounded by rivers, could become an island encircled by water routes. From that angle, Richat's general region, Mauritania's Atlantic margin, and the Saharan interior behind it, doesn't look quite as absurd as a potential source of beyond the pillars lore. You'd still have to assume a long chain of distortions. Local oral traditions turned into Egyptian geographic stories, then retold to Solon, then to Plato, each step smoothing out inconvenient complexities. And this is why this one phrase is such a battlefield. If you insist beyond the Pillars of Heracles means strictly, literally, seaward of Gibraltar in a way an ancient navigator would agree with, a whole class of candidates gets eliminated. Anything in the Mediterranean, anything significantly inland on any coast, anything that requires too much semantic bending. Richat goes out with them. If you allow that ancient geographic language was elastic, that pillars might have shifted location by tradition, that beyond might have been relative or miscopied, that storytellers might compress whole coastal systems into a single dramatic island, then the door swings open. The Azores, the Canaries, Iberia, North Africa's Atlantic coast, even large inland basins tied by river to the ocean all sneak back into play. Neither approach is obviously correct. Both have problems. Take the strict reading, and you're left searching for a vanished island in an ocean floor that modern bathymetry maps in incredible detail, with very little room for a sunken super-civilization. Take the loose reading, and the phrase that was supposed to anchor Atlantis in real geography turns into a kind of poetic shrug, somewhere way out west. What everyone agrees on is that how you interpret that short line does most of the heavy lifting in your theory. For Richat, the stakes are especially high. If beyond the pillars can stretch to include an inland ringed feature that sat upriver from an Atlantic coast, in a world where the Sahara was green and crisscrossed by water, then it can at least sit on the edge of the debate. But Plato doesn't only give us a direction. He also describes the land around Atlantis, a vast plain surrounded by mountains, facing the sea. If we want to test Richat seriously, we have to leave the phrase game behind for a moment and see whether the broader landscape around the eye looks anything like the world Plato sketched. If Atlantis really sat here in or near the Richat, it wouldn't just leave us a cool shape on a satellite photo. It would have left a footprint, not just in geology, in archaeology. So what do we actually find when we stop zooming around on Google Earth and start looking at the ground in Mauritania? First, humans have definitely been in this region for a very long time. Across Mauritania, especially along ancient river valleys and near former lakes, archaeologists have found stone tools from multiple prehistoric periods. Acheulean hand axes from early humans, Middle Stone Age points and flakes. Later, more refined microliths and blade tools from the Late Stone Age. You can walk certain stretches of desert and practically trip over stone artifacts if you know what you're looking for. These tools cluster where water once was, around dry basins, on old terraces above vanished rivers, along the margins of what used to be wetlands during the Sahara's greener phases, the African humid periods when monsoon rains pushed far north and the desert became grassland, savanna, even dotted with trees and lakes. Mauritania, including the wider Adrar region that contains Richat, was part of that green Sahara world. We know this from lake sediments, fossil pollen, and animal remains, hippo, crocodile, fish shells, a landscape that could absolutely support hunter-gatherers, herders, and eventually early farmers. And the archaeology matches. You get widespread evidence of mobile groups, seasonal camps, scattered hearths, stone napping sites. Later you see the shift to pastoralism and early agriculture, the kinds of people who would follow rains, graze livestock, exploit lakes and rivers, then move on when conditions changed. So human presence? Yes, repeatedly, over tens of thousands of years. Now zoom in closer to Richat. The eye sits in the Adrar Plateau, and the plateau itself has documented prehistoric sites, rock art, stone tools, burial tumuli, and occasional more complex stone features that look like enclosures or simple structures. Researchers have reported artifacts on and around the Richat Structure. Lithic scatters, worked stone, evidence of people using the area. But the pattern is familiar. Temporary or seasonal use, not permanent, dense urban settlement. There's no widely accepted excavation report that describes a buried city at Richat. No grid of streets, no foundations of large buildings, no layered urban stratigraphy. What you see as far as current surveys go is what you see across much of the central Sahara. Traces of small groups moving through, exploiting water and resources when conditions allowed, then leaving. Atlantis believers sometimes counter, of course, the city's deeper. It's covered, it's eroded, you haven't dug in the right place. And it's true. Huge portions of Mauritania remain lightly surveyed by modern archaeological standards. There could be significant sites in the wider region we simply haven't found yet. But to test an Atlantis-level claim, we need to be clear about what we'd actually expect to find. Plato's Atlantis is not a village. It's not a clutch of pastoral camps. It's a capital of a powerful maritime state, described with monumental architecture and elaborate planning. Translated into archaeological expectations, that means you'd look for large-scale architecture, foundations of big stone or mud brick buildings, defensive walls, harbour works if it really was coastal, causeways, terraces. Even if built in perishable materials, repeated rebuilding over centuries tends to leave telltale layers, post holes and soil signatures. You'd expect ceramics, lots of them, everyday pottery, storage jars, cooking vessels, transport amphorae if they traded by sea. Pottery is one of the most durable and diagnostic materials archaeologists work with. Styles change over time and region, but if a complex urban culture was here, you'd anticipate a distinctive ceramic tradition scattered for miles. You'd expect evidence of metallurgy. Plato talks about metals, including the mysterious orichalcum. In real terms, a Bronze Age to Iron Age level civilization leaves slag heaps, smelting sites, metal artifacts, crucibles, moulds. Even if looters carried off finished objects, industrial debris tends to stick around. You might even hope for inscriptions or iconography, carved stones, symbolic motifs, any writing system if they had one. The more complex the society, the more likely they are to mark graves, dedicate temples, or label things. So far in and immediately around the Richat itself, we don't see that package. We see the normal Saharan record: stone tools, traces of small-scale structures, rock art. Fascinating, absolutely. Testimony to resilient people adapting to a changing environment. But not the dense, multi-layered urban footprint that screams lost capital of a great empire. This absence is one of the big under-discussed problems for a direct Richat equals Atlantis claim. Because the desert is harsh, but it's not a perfect eraser. Yes, wind erosion is brutal. Sand can scour surfaces, bury sites, and move artifacts. Organic materials, wood, textiles, leather, rot quickly unless conditions are extremely dry and stable. Floods during wetter periods can rearrange sediments, wash away light structures, and redeposit materials in confusing ways. But deserts also preserve. The same aridity that kills plants can mummify bodies, dry out mud brick, and keep pottery shards essentially intact for thousands of years. Across North Africa and the Near East, some of the best preserved ancient sites are in arid zones, collapsed walls still standing, painted pottery still bright, inscriptions sharp enough to read. If a large, long-lived, technologically advanced city had once occupied the Richat Basin, if it had buildings, workshops, storerooms, temples, docks, streets, you'd expect at least fragments of that complexity to survive. Tumbled blocks in unnatural alignments, concentrated ceramic dumps, metalworking residues, patterned anomalies in soil chemistry. Something that pushes archaeologists to say, this isn't just another campsite or small settlement. Instead, everything we have points to what the climate and geography suggest. Ephemeral human presences tracking water and resources through a landscape that shifted from green to desert and back again over very long timescales. Could a more modest regional centre have existed somewhere in the broader Mauritanian lowlands during a humid phase, something that, through many layers of retelling, got inflated into Plato's vast island power? That's harder to rule out. West Africa's deep past is still underexplored. There are gaps in our map, both literally and figuratively. But there's a difference between we haven't mapped every site and a city of the scale and complexity Plato describes once sat right here and left essentially no trace. For the Richat-as-Atlantis hypothesis, that gap is the elephant in the sand. To bridge it, you have to either dramatically downsize what Atlantis was in real historical terms, or propose destruction and erosion on a scale that somehow scrubs away the big stuff while leaving ordinary prehistoric scatters intact. Neither move is impossible, but both raise new questions. And that's where the landscape around the eye becomes crucial. Because even if the Bullseye itself isn't giving us a buried metropolis, the world Plato describes around Atlantis, a vast plain ringed by mountains facing the sea, might still have a geological echo in the terrain beyond Richat's rings. Plato doesn't just talk about a fancy ringed city. He anchors that city in a very specific landscape. He describes a vast, perfectly level oblong plain, 3,000 stadia long, 2,000 wide, roughly 550 by 370 kilometers if you convert using common estimates, bordered on all sides by mountains, open on one side toward the sea, cut by a grid of canals running straight in measured intervals, a kind of engineered breadbasket for a maritime empire. So how do Richat supporters map that onto Mauritania? They usually do it like this. They treat the Richat structure itself as the central city. Then they look north, east and south across the wider Adrar region and adjacent lowlands and say, there's your plain. From satellite height, you can see why this is tempting. To the west and northwest of Richat, the land drops toward the coastal zone, a mix of dunes and low relief. To the immediate east and south, you have stretches of relatively flat terrain, plateaus shaved off by erosion, broad sandy expanses, ancient drainage basins. For someone wanting a big flat agricultural plain, this looks like the right neighbourhood. Then there are the mountains. Supporters point to the Adrar Plateau itself, the elevated mass that Richat is carved into, as the beginning of a surrounding highland. They extend that ring visually to include the Tagant Plateau to the south, the higher country toward the east, and in some versions the more rugged terrains further north toward Morocco and Western Sahara. On a broad hand-waving scale, you can sketch a sort of polygon of raised ground, loosely encircling a lower-lying heartland. From space, it's possible to draw a line and say, plain in the middle, mountains around, ocean out west. Atlantis, right? But when you stop tracing lines on Google Earth and start comparing details, things get messier. First, the size and shape problem. Plato's plain is rectangular, deliberately measured, level and smooth and straight-sided. It's supposed to be an engineered or at least carefully organized space. When you look at central Mauritania, you don't see anything like a single, discrete, giant rectangular lowland. You see a patchwork. There are plateaus broken by escarpments, interdune corridors, fossil river valleys, basins of different elevations. The topography is complex, not a simple box in the middle of a mountain fence. Could you carve out a 550 by 370 kilometre rectangle on a map and say, this is the Atlantis plain? Sure, you can always draw a rectangle, but that's the point. You're imposing geometry onto a landscape that doesn't obviously give it to you. Then there's the mountain ring. Plato describes mountains that surrounded the plain, celebrated for their number, size and beauty, sheltering the interior from harsh weather. It sounds like a clear continuous ring of highland enclosing a basin, with one side open toward the sea. The Adrar Plateau is real high ground, but it's not a continuous mountain wall around a single central plain. It's one of several plateaus separated by lower areas, cut by wadis, and graded into other forms of relief. The Tagant to the south, the Hod and Ara, and further uplands to the east and southeast. They form a broader highland zone across the Western Sahara, but not a neat circular fence around a singular plain. In other words, if you zoom out enough, you can say mountains around, lowlands inside. But that's true of a lot of places on Earth. Directionality adds another headache. Plato is very specific about orientation. The plain is described as lying near the centre of the island, opening toward the sea, with the greatest length running along the coast. The surrounding mountains are said to be to the north, sheltering the island from cold winds. The city itself is south of the plain, closer to the sea. Now try to map that onto Richat. Is the sea supposed to be the Atlantic, west of Mauritania? If so, the coastline runs roughly north-south. You'd want your long axis of the plain more or less parallel to that coast. Some proponents rotate the whole mental map, placing the plain to the east of Richat and pretending that south in Plato could mean east in today's coordinates because of some copying error or ancient misunderstanding. Others flip the orientation entirely, arguing that what Plato called north was actually south, relative to Egypt, or that the descriptions were symbolic, not literal. The problem isn't that any one of these tweaks is impossible. Ancient texts do get directions wrong. Translators make choices. Oral stories shift. The problem is cumulative. Every time a feature doesn't quite line up, plain shape, mountain layout, city position, coastline direction, You solve it by bending the text a little more. North becomes east, surrounding mountains become scattered plateaus. A rectangular plain becomes a general lowland region. Centre of the island becomes somewhere in the interior of a continent. At a certain point, you're not matching Plato to Mauritania. You're reinterpreting Plato until he happens to fit Mauritania. That's where selective matching comes in. If you start from Richat must be Atlantis, your brain will happily latch onto every similarity, ring shapes, nearby plains, any mountains at all, and quietly downplay the mismatches. This is confirmation bias in map form. To test it systematically, you'd flip the process. Instead of starting with Richat, you'd start with Plato's landscape description as a checklist before you pick any candidate. You'd list attributes: central ring city with specific dimensions, surrounding plain of specific size and orientation, mountains enclosing the plain on most sides, an opening to the sea along the long side of the plain, navigable channels from sea to city, climate conditions implied by crops and animals, direction of cold winds and the sheltering effect of mountains. Then you'd scan the globe, coastal zones, especially for regions that match the pattern without you forcing it. Richat would be just one candidate among many. You'd ask, how many boxes does each region tick, and how many conflicts does it introduce? On a rough pass, the Richat-as-Atlantis area does okay on broad visual vibes: ring-like centre, semi-enclosed interior zone, coast not crazy far away. It does worse when you zoom into the specifics Plato actually gives: dimensions, orientation, the clarity of the mountain ring, the engineered nature of the plain. Visually, from orbit, you can absolutely understand why people see an echo of Plato's world here. The concentric eye, the plateau shoulders, the sweep of the western coast, they create a kind of myth-friendly geography. A place that feels like it should have a story. Textually, once you lay Plato's blueprint over the real topography, you spend more and more effort adjusting the blueprint. Maybe that's acceptable if you treat Atlantis as a loose, mythologized memory of some far-off western land, where details can drift, directions can flip, and names can melt together over centuries. But if the claim is tight, that Plato was giving a reasonably accurate geographic description, and the Richat region is that description made stone, then the fit between the Atlantis plain and the Mauritanian landscape starts to strain. And that tension becomes even sharper when you bring in the last big puzzle piece in Plato's geography. Not just plains and mountains, but the sea. The bit about being beyond the Pillars of Heracles, and what that actually means on a modern map. Plato doesn't just park Atlantis on a map and leave it there. He blows it up. In both dialogues, the ending is brutal and strangely specific. After the Athenians defeat the Atlantean army, the gods decide this arrogant, luxurious superpower has gone too far. Then, in a single day and night of misfortune, you get earthquakes, floods, and the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. Moral cause, physical effect. The disaster isn't just background flavour, it's the punchline. The whole story is framed as a warning about what happens when a powerful state forgets moderation and justice. Nature itself, or the gods working through nature, literally swallows the offender. So, what are we actually looking at here? If you peel away the divine anger and focus on the mechanics, Plato is describing a rapid compound catastrophe: strong earthquakes, massive flooding, sudden submergence of land that used to be dry, all of it happening on a timescale you could, in theory, live through, one day and one night, on Earth. What does that combination usually mean? You don't need gods. You need tectonics and water. Big earthquakes can trigger submarine landslides. Those landslides can trigger tsunamis. Entire stretches of coast can slump downward, sometimes permanently in what geologists call coastal subsidence. In extreme cases, A low-lying island or delta can lose meters of elevation relative to sea level in minutes to hours. There are modern analogues, all within recorded history. In 365 CE, a huge earthquake off Crete generated a tsunami that devastated coastlines from Greece to Egypt. Ancient writers describe harbours emptied of water, ships left on dry ground, and then walls of water smashing inland. Some coastal areas were uplifted, others sagged. In 1755, Lisbon was hit by a magnitude 8+ quake. Buildings collapsed, fires started, and then a tsunami rolled up the Tagus River. Parts of the waterfront simply vanished, dropping into newly opened fissures. To people standing there, it must have looked like the city was being eaten. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake in Japan produced a tsunami that ripped entire towns off the map. Concrete seawalls were overrun, farmland became seabed. Low-lying districts went from houses and roads to open water in less than an hour. If you were an ancient storyteller experiencing or hearing about events like these, compressing them into one day and night of wrathful ocean is not only plausible, it's almost inevitable. Memory simplifies. Now layer that onto Plato's Atlantis, a low, broad plain adjoining the sea, crisscrossed by canals, fronted by a harbour and ringed channels. It's a coastal, hydraulic landscape by definition, vulnerable. If Atlantis were anywhere near an active plate boundary, like the Hellenic Arc or the Azores-Gibraltar fracture zone, you'd have the right physical ingredients to generate a story about a city and its plain being smashed by quakes and drowned by the sea. Which brings us back to the Sahara. Can an inland site, hundreds of kilometres from the modern Atlantic shore, really be what Plato had in mind when he describes a landmass sunk beneath the sea in a single catastrophic episode? Richat proponents usually answer that by changing the water, not the story. They argue that during past humid periods, or during some hypothesized marine incursion, the Western Sahara wasn't a barren desert. It might have held large lakes, inland seas, or shallow marine gulfs reaching farther inland than today. In that picture, submergence becomes flooding by a paleolake or transgressing shoreline, not the open Atlantic we see now. There are problems with this. First, the time frame. The last time the Atlantic pushed significantly farther into the continent in this region was on geological timescales, millions of years ago, not 10,000 or 12,000 years ago. Sea levels have risen since the last glacial maximum, but we don't see evidence of a Holocene age marine bay cutting deep into Mauritania and then vanishing overnight. Second, the mechanics. You can drown a river valley quickly with a landslide dam or glacial lake outburst. You can drown a small basin with a catastrophic flood. But to make an entire island with a giant plain and central city disappear into the depths of the sea, from an inland position you'd need either enormous subsidence or a truly colossal basin-filling event. The geology around Richat does not show a young, sudden drop of that magnitude. It's an uplift structure, deeply eroded. The story in the rocks is slow exposure, and stripping, not abrupt collapse. Third, the language. Plato doesn't say it was flooded in a generic way. He talks about the sea becoming impassable and impenetrable because of the shoal of mud left behind where the island had sunk. That's a coastal mariner's description. A former island, now a hazard to navigation. Close enough to known sea routes that Egyptian sailors, or their stories, would be aware of it. You can stretch that to mean some ancient inland sea, now gone, whose muddy shallows blocked mythical boats. But the more you bend the words, the more you drift from the original sense, an oceanic island in an ocean everyone knew. This is where alternative readings come in. One option is to treat the catastrophe as almost entirely metaphorical. Athens stands in for Plato's ideal state, Atlantis stands in for decadent imperial powers. Persia, maybe Carthage, maybe even a cautionary mirror held up to Athens itself. In that frame, one day and night is a narrative device. Swift, decisive judgment. The geology doesn't have to work out because the story is political philosophy, not disaster reporting. Another option is hybrid, a real, half-remembered disaster underneath a thick layer of symbolism. Maybe there was a major Bronze Age quake and tsunami in the eastern Mediterranean, like Thera erupting and smashing Minoan harbours, that created an enduring cultural trauma. Over centuries, that trauma could migrate west in the imagination, inflate in scale, and get fused with travel tales about lands beyond the known straits. By Plato's time, you're no longer talking about one specific island or one specific town, but a composite catastrophe. In that view, sinking doesn't have to be literal vertical motion of bedrock. It's a shorthand for towns destroyed, coasts rearranged, ports buried under new shorelines. Like when we say Pompeii was buried by Vesuvius, we're talking about ash and pyroclastic flows, not the city physically moving downward through the crust. The key distinction is this: a catastrophe memory versus a literal city vanished underwater. A catastrophe memory can be triggered by all kinds of things: tsunamis, floods, deltas subsiding, barrier islands breached. It can preserve the emotional truth of sudden loss without being precise about the mechanics. A literal interpretation, on the other hand, asks for a specific mappable event, a landmass here, above sea level, a violent transition, then ocean over the top, with physical traces you can still in principle find. If you assign Plato to the first category, then almost any dramatic coastal disaster in the wider Mediterranean Atlantic world could be part of the DNA of the Atlantis tale. Thera, Helike, Lisbon-style quakes, regional tsunamis, take your pick. If you insist on the second, an inland Sahara site has a much harder job. It has to explain away not just the directions and the geography, but the water itself. Why a story so obsessed with submergence by the sea would actually be about a plateau in the middle of a continent. That tension doesn't make the Richat idea impossible. It just forces a choice. Either Atlantis is a flexible, allegorical story woven around hazy disaster memories, in which case you have to let go of strict literal matching, or it's a fairly direct report of an island that really did sink beneath the ocean in a violent event, in which case your candidate has to sit in a geologically and hydrologically plausible danger zone. The Richat structure may line up with some architectural vibes in Plato, the rings, the centrality, but when you follow the floodwater, the one day and night motif pulls you back toward the coastlines, not the desert interior. Richat isn't trying to convince you in a vacuum, it's stepping into a crowded room. For more than a century, people have been playing this game with Plato's text. Take the description, pick a spot on the map, and start lining up bullet points. Once you know what to look for, it's astonishing how many places can be made to fit. Take the classic favourite, Thera, better known as Santorini. Here you've actually got an island that really did undergo a spectacular Bronze Age catastrophe. Around the 1600s BCE, a volcanic eruption blew the centre out of the island, triggered tsunamis across the Aegean, and rained ash over a huge area. You want one day and night of misfortune? A VI7 eruption will do it. Thera checks some big boxes, violent destruction with quakes and floods. A maritime culture smashed by forces of nature. A time window that's at least in the same general neighbourhood as Plato's story, if you treat his 9,000 years as symbolic or miscopied. But then you hit the misses. Santorini is small compared to Plato's vast island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, as he understood those terms. The topography doesn't give you that broad, rectangular plain, 3,000 by 2,000 stadia, with surrounding mountains and a huge population. The central crater is a ring, yes, but that's a caldera, not a nested set of artificial canals. So the way theory proponents handle this is familiar. Some details are literal, others are moral metaphor, others are garbled over centuries of retelling. The eruption is real. The empire and the gigantic plain are exaggerations grown around it. Then there's Crete and the Minoans. Here, the match is political and cultural. A thalassocracy, a sea power with advanced architecture, plumbing, art and writing dominating the eastern Mediterranean from a big island base. A wealthy, seemingly confident civilization that suffered serious hits from earthquakes, tsunamis, and perhaps social collapse soon after the Thera eruption. It's not hard to look at Knossos and other palace complexes and hear an echo of a great and wondrous power ruling over many islands and parts of the mainland. The time frame also sits nicely just before the classical Greek world, making cultural memory more plausible. But again, the geometry and geography strain. Crete is long and narrow, not a circular island with a central city surrounded by concentric moats. The big rectangular plain in Plato's account doesn't slot cleanly onto Cretan topography. The beyond the Pillars of Heracles line has to be massaged to mean beyond a different set of pillars in the Aegean, or treated as a later overlay. So the pattern repeats. The parts that work get foregrounded, the sea power, the disaster, the opulence, and the awkward bits are labelled symbolic or corrupted. Move farther west and you hit the Iberian candidates, especially around the Doñana wetlands, near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River in southern Spain. Here the appeal is almost geographical literalism. A broad, low plain near the Atlantic, a river leading inland. Evidence for ancient harbour works and settlements that may have been affected by shifting coastlines, silting and possibly tsunamis from earthquakes along the Azores-Gibraltar fault zone. Some reconstructions imagine a Bronze Age or pre-Bronze Age port city near a marshy coastal lagoon that later silted up, leaving a shoal of mud that made navigation dangerous. You can see how someone could read Plato's mud-choked sea and think, that sounds like a silting estuary on the Atlantic rim. But then, where are the clear concentric harbour works? Where's the monumental stone architecture on the scale Plato implies? Where's the unmistakable high-status capital city footprint? So far, the archaeology is suggestive rather than definitive. And then there are the oceanic outliers, the Azores hypotheses. The Azores sit out in the North Atlantic, on a tectonically complex zone, with volcanic islands, deep waters, and submarine plateaus. Advocates argue that if any place could host an island that later sank or subsided partially, it would be here near mid-ocean ridges and fracture zones. On paper, you can tick some attractive boxes, located beyond the pillars in the open Atlantic, in a seismically and volcanically active region. If you're willing to invoke Ice Age sea levels and unstable island blocks, you can sketch a scenario where a larger landmass once existed and later broke up, with only fragments like the present Azores remaining. But the hard evidence is thin. The bathymetry doesn't show a big, recently submerged plateau with archaeological ruins sitting in shallow water. The timescales for significant crustal movements here are usually deep time, not sudden Holocene collapses. So the fit leans heavily on what could be true, not on what we can actually point to. Line all of these up. Thera, Crete, Doñana, the Azores, and a pattern jumps out. Each candidate matches some subset of Plato's checklist: a powerful maritime culture, a big, fertile plain, dramatic earthquakes and floods, a location relative to the pillars that can be argued in or out, some kind of circular or ring-like topography, but none of them hits everything cleanly. And yet, to their strongest supporters, each one can feel like the answer. That feeling is exactly what confirmation bias looks like when you map it onto landscapes. If you start with Atlantis was in Spain, your brain will latch onto every rectangular field, every ancient canal, every marsh that might once have been a bay, and quietly ignore the missing rings, the wrong scale, the awkward directions. If you start with Atlantis was a volcanic island, you'll see every caldera as a potential concentric city and treat the absence of giant artificial canals as a minor storytelling flourish. Richat sits squarely in this same ecosystem of interpretations. Its supporters foreground the perfect-looking concentric rings, the approximate scale of the central structure, the presence of an adjacent plane, the idea of an advanced culture in an unexpected place. The problems, the inland position, the uplift geology, the lack of a catastrophic marine submergence get reframed as either mistranslations, symbolic language, or lost paleo lakes. From a distance, the argumentative moves look remarkably similar across all camps. Highlight the overlaps, soften, or reinterpret the conflicts, and declare your spot a good fit. If you want to compare these candidates fairly, you need some criteria that don't care which horse you already like. At minimum, you'd want to weigh textual alignment. How closely does the location match Plato's directions, distances, and relative geography without heavy reinterpretation? Topographic fit. Do the physical features, plains, mountains, harbours, possible rings, match in scale and configuration, or are we forcing analogies? Catastrophe plausibility. Does the geology support a sudden, severe event with earthquakes and flooding on the relevant timescale? Archaeological support. Is there evidence for a complex, centralized society of the right era in or near the proposed site? Degree of bending required. How many parts of the text need to be called allegory, error, or copyist slip to make the match work? Applied across the board, those criteria are ruthless. They don't just push back on Richat, they push back on everyone. And that's the point. When you realize how many different coastlines, islands, and even deserts can be made to wear the Atlantis costume, if you squint just right, you start to see the story itself differently, not as a GPS coordinate waiting to be decoded, but as something more fluid. Maybe that something more fluid is the real twist. Instead of asking which single place was Atlantis, there's another question you can ask that instantly changes the game. What if Atlantis was never about one place at all? Call it the composite myth idea. In this view, Plato isn't handing us a straight historical report that accidentally got the map wrong. He's stitching together a quilt, pieces of real catastrophes, real cultures, real anxieties, and real achievements, all layered and polished until they read like the story of one lost super island. And human cultures do this all the time. Oral traditions are not newspapers. They're compression algorithms. They take generations of events, wars, famines, migrations, disasters, and squeeze them into stories that are emotionally memorable and morally useful. A single hero might carry the deeds of 10 different people. One great battle stands in for centuries of raids and skirmishes. A flood that actually happened in a single river valley grows over time into a world-drowning deluge. You don't remember the exact rainfall or the actual sequence of days. You remember the water rose, the world almost ended, and the only reason we're here is because someone listened, someone prepared, someone survived. That's how memories make it across hundreds of years without writing. They get symbolic packaging, so imagine the Mediterranean and North Africa not as a stage for one Atlantis event, but as a long, noisy laboratory of disasters and contacts. You've got the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, a synchronized failure of palace cultures from Greece to Anatolia, to the Levant and beyond. Trade networks shatter, cities burn, literacy plunges, sea peoples raid, earthquakes and drought ripple across the region. From the ground, living through that, how does it feel? It doesn't feel like a slow, complex, multi-cause systems failure that future archaeologists will argue about. It feels like the gods turned against the world, like an age of heroes and great kingdoms went down in a span of one day and night, as far as your grandparents' stories are concerned. Layer onto that the memory of earlier shocks, the Thera eruption and tsunamis. Localized but apocalyptic for anyone on those coasts. Harbours erased, fleets smashed, low-lying towns hit by walls of water with no warning. Then think about everyday hazards that don't make headlines in our textbooks, but leave scars in oral memory. Nile floods that go wrong, earthquakes in the Aegean, sudden storms that take whole convoys of ships, coastal subsidence that drowns old ports and turns fertile fields into marshland. Now add seafaring. By the late Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, you have Phoenicians, Greeks, and others pushing along the North African shore into the western Mediterranean, up to Iberia, maybe out to Atlantic islands. They're trading metals, dyes, grain, stories, gods. In taverns and at campfires, sailors compare notes. There was once a rich coastal city here, they say, but it lies under the waves. There's a place over there where the sea is treacherously shallow, full of hidden shoals. There's a people down that coast who build in strange ways, who worship unfamiliar gods, who claim their ancestors came from a great island that no longer exists. None of this has to be precisely true for it to stick. It just has to be memorable enough to repeat. By the time Solon or some other early Greek traveller sits in an Egyptian temple and listens to priests talk about old disasters and older wars, they're hearing a stack of compressed memories. Egypt itself had watched trade routes rise and fall, foreign invaders come and go, neighbouring polities crumble. When an Egyptian priest says in Plato's retelling that the Greeks are like children, with no clear memory of the really ancient catastrophes, he's voicing exactly this problem. History erodes, but myth persists. So picture a huge, messy mosaic. Real seafaring empires like the Minoans and later thalassocracies. Real floods, quakes, tsunamis scattered across centuries. Real coastal plains, real marshes that used to be harbours. Real stories from North African and Atlantic facing peoples whose own memories are already mythologized by the time a Greek hears them Plato, then walks into this mosaic with an agenda. He's not a field archaeologist. He's a philosopher using narrative as a tool. In Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis isn't just a cool mystery box. It's a foil, a morally convenient civilization designed to contrast with his idealized Athens. Atlantis is rich, technologically impressive, expansionist, and crucially, corruptible. It starts virtuous, then decays into arrogance and imperial overreach. The gods punish it. The moral lesson practically underlines itself. To do that effectively, Plato needs scale and drama. A local harbour town lost to a tsunami isn't enough. He inflates bigger island, bigger plain, bigger fleets. Longer canals. He compounds separate memories of floods, of earthquakes, of toppled sea powers into one colossal downfall. If an Egyptian tradition spoke vaguely of catastrophic floods that ended an age thousands of years before, Plato can translate that into 9,000 years ago. If sailors spoke of a once dangerous, now shoal sea beyond a narrow strait, he can wrap that into beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where shallows remain after the island sank. He's not lying in the modern sense. He's doing what storytellers have always done, taking a jumble of raw material and reshaping it so it serves a clear philosophical purpose. Once you see Atlantis this way as a mosaic rather than a snapshot, something important shifts in the modern hunt. A composite Atlantis doesn't mean nothing real happened. It means lots of real things probably did happen, but they were smeared together across time and space before they ever reached Plato's desk. If that's right, then looking for a one-to-one GPS-accurate match becomes almost impossible by definition. No single site, whether it's Santorini, Crete, Doñana, the Azores, or the Richat Structure, can ever tick every box honestly, because the boxes themselves are hybrid, part history, part myth, part philosophical art project. Under a composite model, when a place lines up with some aspects of the story, rings, plains, disasters, seafaring power, that might mean you found one tile in the larger mosaic, not the entire picture. Which raises an awkward but important question for the Richat theory. Even if Richat echoes some details in an uncanny way, are we dealing with the lost capital of a single vanished empire? Or just one more landscape that happens to rhyme, with a story that was never about just one landscape to begin with? If that's the case, then why does Richat feel so convincing anyway? Why does this particular tile in the mosaic grab people's imaginations so hard that whole channels, forums and threads orbit around it? A big part of the answer has nothing to do with Plato or Egypt or Bronze Age seafaring at all. It has to do with something that didn't exist for virtually all of human history, the God's eye view. Until a few decades ago, nobody, no farmer in Mauritania, no French geologist in the 1960s, no Greek sailor in antiquity, ever saw the Richat structure the way you see it when you zoom in on Google Earth. From the ground, Richat is a series of eroded ridges and low hills. Impressive up close, sure, but not a neat target pattern. You're walking inside the rings, so you don't experience them as rings at all. From orbit, it's different. Satellite imagery takes a messy three-dimensional landscape and flattens it into something your brain can grasp in one instant, a circular bullseye, clear as a logo. Your pattern recognition hardware fires. Concentric rings, check. Central island, check. Roughly the right scale? Close enough for a conspiracy thumbnail. The timing matters too. Richat had been known to geologists since at least the mid-20th century. They mapped it, argued about its origin, published in journals. But it doesn't explode into the public imagination until those images become free, high-resolution and shareable. First with early satellite atlases, then with NASA pictures, then with Google Earth, then with social media. You don't need a university. You don't need access to field reports. You just drag the little yellow guy over Western Sahara, zoom out, take a screenshot, slap Plato's diagram on top, and hit upload. That move the overlay is where the persuasive magic really kicks in. Someone takes a ring diagram from a modern rendering of Plato's Atlantis. They resize it until the outermost circle roughly matches the outermost visible ridge of Richat. Maybe they tweak the opacity so you can see both at once. They label the central Acropolis, the outer city, the plain. Now, instead of hearing, some people think this structure looks a bit like Plato's description. You're seeing it. Your eyes do the work before your critical thinking ever kicks in. This is classic map persuasion. You pick a projection. You pick a scale. You decide which features count as edges and which ones you ignore. Every little choice is a kind of argument, but it's hidden inside what looks like neutral geometry. If you pull Plato's rings a little larger or smaller, you can make them fit all kinds of things. Volcanic calderas, ancient river meanders, impact craters, even modern cities with ring roads. But you rarely see the failed overlays. You only see the hits. That's the survivorship bias of visual arguments. The map that doesn't line up gets deleted. The one that kind of, sort of, maybe matches, goes viral. And as soon as that matching image exists, it begins to live a life independent of the underlying evidence. Peer-reviewed papers about Richat's geology move slowly. They're dense, full of jargon, cautious in their claims. They don't come with dramatic background music or red arrows. A viral graphic does. A single TikTok, a single YouTube short, a single Twitter thread can show millions of people the perfect match in under a minute. Most of those viewers are never going to dig through stratigraphic diagrams or radiometric dates. For many, that first impression becomes the default model. I saw the picture. It fits, therefore, Atlantis. This doesn't mean everyone pushing the Richat-Atlantis idea is malicious or faking things. There's a spectrum on one end. You have honest curiosity. People who stumble on the satellite view and think, "Whoa, that looks Atlantean. I wonder what scientists say about it." Then actually go and read. They might still lean toward the exciting interpretation, but they at least engage with counter-arguments and uncertainties. In the middle, you have enthusiastic amplifiers. They see a compelling overlay, don't really check the details, and share it because it's cool. They're not trying to hoax anyone. They're just treating an untested idea like a fun fact. On the far end, you have deliberate sensationalism. Thumbnails with 100% proof and scientists stunned claims that mainstream archaeologists are hiding Richat's true nature, even though there's no evidence of a cover-up, just a lack of data that supports the Atlantis angle. And woven through all of that, you have outright hoaxes, mislabeled photos, wildly distorted maps, numbers quietly changed so that distances line up better than they actually do. So how do you as a viewer navigate this mess? How do you enjoy the sense of wonder without getting swept away by the nearest ring-shaped rabbit hole? There are some simple tools you can use whenever someone says, "This place is really Atlantis," or "This site proves X ancient mystery." First, check the asymmetry. Are you being shown only the hits or also the misses? If a creator can overlay Plato's rings on Richat, ask, did they try overlaying them on 10 other ringed structures and only show you the best match? Second, look for timestamps. Any Atlantis candidate lives or dies on chronology. If a video claims a site is Atlantis, ask what dates the geology and archaeology give. If the argument boils down to scientists are wrong about the dates, without providing a clear mechanism or alternative evidence, that's a red flag. Third, watch the language. Claims that use words like might, may, or could are being appropriately cautious. Claims that jump straight to proves, guarantees, or no doubt while relying on visuals and vibes are selling more than they're showing. Fourth, separate looks like from is, a structure looking like a description, is the starting point of an investigation, not the end of one. Visual similarity can suggest a hypothesis, but it doesn't confirm anything on its own. Fifth, trace the sources. If a creator references Plato, geology papers, or archaeological surveys, see if you can find those sources yourself. You don't have to read every word, but you can check whether the quotes and numbers actually say what the video claims. When you apply these tools to Richat, the picture changes. It still looks uncanny from space. The rings still make your brain itch with possibility. The overlays are still fun to play with, but you start to see them as what they are, persuasive illustrations, not decisive evidence. You can hold both ideas at once. That the Richat structure is an extraordinary, visually striking geological feature that happens to rhyme with parts of Plato's story, and that the modern Atlantis at Richat craze is as much a product of satellites, social media, and our own pattern-hungry minds as it is of anything that might have happened in the Sahara thousands of years ago. And once you see that, you're ready for the next step in the investigation. Not just how theories spread, but what it would actually take to move a place like Richat from viral maybe to serious contender. So let's do something most viral theories never bother with. Let's pretend we're actually trying to test the idea that Atlantis was at Richat. Not vibe, check it. Not overlay it, test it. First, you need a hypothesis that sticks its neck out. Something that doesn't just say, this looks similar, but if this is true, then we should find X, Y, and Z. For an Atlantis at Richat scenario, that means making uncomfortable, risky predictions. If Plato is even loosely describing a real city here, and if Richat was that city, then you don't just get pretty rings. You get a capital, you get infrastructure, you get trash. You'd expect, at minimum, a dense concentration of human-made stuff in and around the central island and inner rings. Not a few scattered stone tools from random errors, but a coherent occupational horizon, pottery shards, worked metals, house foundations, storage pits, middens. You'd expect defensive or ceremonial architecture that roughly respects the ring layout. Walls, foundations, terraces that track the curves. You'd expect evidence of water management, because Atlantis is described as a harbour city. Canals, quays, cut stone embankments, places where boats docked, goods were loaded, taxes were collected. If this was a major maritime power, you'd expect trade goods that don't belong to the local geology at all. Obsidian from distant volcanic fields, shells from far-off coasts, exotic stones worked into beads or inlays. And here's the crucial part. Those things would all need to cluster in time. Plato's story pegs Atlantis at a particular era in relation to Athens. Most scholars think his exact number, 9,000 years before Solon, is mythic inflation. But even if you're generous and stretch the window, you don't get infinite wiggle room. You'd need a city-like level of occupation at Richat, dating to some plausible prehistoric time frame where complex societies and large-scale seafaring exist at all. Not a few flint flakes from 100,000 years ago. Not a nomadic camp from 4,000 years ago. A serious settlement with stratigraphy and dates that hang together. Those are testable predictions. We can phrase them even more brutally. If Richat is Atlantis, then there should be clear archaeological signatures of an urban-scale, water-focused society in and around the structure, at some coherent point in late prehistory. If careful, wide-ranging surveys and excavations fail to find that, then the Richat-Atlantis hypothesis is in deep trouble. Once you've made predictions, the next question is, how do you look? This is where modern tools actually become interesting, not just for making thumbnails, but for doing science. Remote sensing is the first pass. LiDAR, laser scanning usually from aircraft, can strip away vegetation and reveal subtle shapes in the ground, buried walls, old field systems, canal embankments. It's revolutionized archaeology in jungles and temperate forests. In the Sahara, where vegetation is sparse, LiDAR is less about seeing through trees and more about capturing microtopography, faint terraces, platform edges, leveled surfaces that don't quite look natural. Ground-penetrating radar is the next layer. It sends radio waves into the ground and measures reflections. Different materials, stone, packed earth, voids, bounce the signal back differently. You can spot buried foundations, cavities, even old river channels without digging a single trench. Multispectral and hyperspectral imaging go yet another route. Instead of just visible light, they measure many wavelengths. Archaeological features can show up as subtle differences in soil moisture, mineral content, or vegetation stress. An old canal that's been filled in might still trap a bit more water than surrounding ground. A buried wall might change how plants grow above it. All of this can be flown over Richat and its surrounding plain. If the Atlantis idea is onto something, you'd predict these techniques to light up the area with anomalies. Repeated circular or linear features that look like human planning, not just random fracture patterns and erosion. If the data come back and it's all just tilted beds, natural drainage and wind-sculpted rock, that doesn't fully disprove human activity. People can live lightly on the land. But it starts to chip away at the lost supercity narrative. Of course, remote sensing only gets you so far. Eventually, you have to put a shovel or a trowel or a core sampler into the ground. That's where the realities of fieldwork slam into the fantasy. You can't just roll up to Mauritania with a backhoe and a dream of Atlantis. You need permits from local and national authorities. You need collaboration with local archaeologists and universities. You need agreements about who owns any finds, how they're conserved, how they're reported. You need funding, salaries, equipment, satellite data, vehicles, fuel, water, security. The Sahara is not a friendly environment. It's hot, remote, and logistically punishing. Every extra kilometre from the nearest road doubles your headache. You also need to protect the site from the very attention you're giving it. If you loudly brand an area likely Atlantis and then leave, you've just painted a target on it for looters and treasure hunters. Responsible teams have to think about that. Sometimes the best move is to underhype, to quietly survey and document rather than promise global revelations by next summer. Then there's the division of labour between geology and archaeology. Geology can tell you how the Richat Structure formed, and roughly when key events happened: uplift, erosion, volcanic activity, the presence or absence of ancient shorelines or lake beds. If the rocks in those rings solidified hundreds of millions of years before humans existed, geology can say with a straight face, the rings themselves are not human-built harbours. They are bedrock, not concrete wharves. If there's no evidence of a marine incursion into the structure in the last, say, 100,000 years, geology can say this was not a seaport in any realistic window for advanced human civilizations. That's falsification. Geology can slam some doors shut. But geology can't confirm Atlantis. You can have a perfectly plausible environment for a city, an inland basin with water, fertile soils, nearby resources, and still no city. Only archaeology can bridge that gap. Only archaeology can say, here is a human-made wall. Here is a workshop. Here is a cemetery with grave goods that match a certain level of social complexity. Here is a radiocarbon sequence that tells us when these people lived here and how long they stayed. And even then, archaeology can say there was a complex settlement here. Not this is definitely Plato's Atlantis. The myth label is always interpretive, always layered on afterward. Underneath all of this sits the uncomfortable truth. Science keeps whispering, you almost never get a single smoking gun. You get a slow pile-up of clues, a pottery shard here, a soil core there, a weird anomaly on a radar scan, a date that doesn't fit earlier assumptions. Over years, sometimes decades, a picture sharpens or fades. A scientific mindset means being willing to live in that in-between state. Interested, but not sold. Willing to be surprised, but also willing to walk away when the evidence doesn't cooperate with your favourite story. For Richat, that's where we are. We have a visually striking structure that raises questions. We have geological work that answers some of them and leaves others open. We have scattered archaeological finds in the broader region, but not yet the dense, ring-aligned, port-level city Plato's story would require. Could more fieldwork change that? Yes. Does the current evidence force us to accept Richat as Atlantis? No. And that tension between what's ruled out, what's merely possible, and what would actually need to show up in the sand, that's what separates a good mystery from a good myth. Which brings us back to a phrase you see a lot in Atlantis videos about Richat. Nobody can explain why. Nobody can explain why is a powerful phrase. It triggers a very specific reaction in your brain. Mystery detected. Authority questioned. Adventure unlocked. But if you zoom in on how scientists actually talk about Richat, the picture is a lot less dramatic, and in some ways more interesting. because a lot of what gets packaged as inexplicable is, in fact, pretty well explained. Start with the big one. Why is there a giant, almost circular, multi-ringed formation in the middle of the Sahara? Geologists don't shrug at that. They don't say, wow, no idea, must be Atlantis. They say that's what you'd expect from a deeply eroded, dome-shaped uplift. What's called a structural dome. Layers of rock that were originally flat got pushed up into a broad, gentle bulge, probably related to ancient tectonic activity and magmatic intrusions back in the age of the dinosaurs. Over tens of millions of years, wind and water went to work. Softer layers eroded faster, harder layers resisted. The result, concentric ridges and valleys like the growth rings of a tree that's been sliced open. Those alternating rings of sandstone and limestone, mapped, logged, and dated. The central area with slightly different rocks and some igneous bodies studied. The uplift itself fits into a regional story of West African geology that has nothing to do with human beings at all. So at that level, the headline, "Nobody can explain why the Richat structure is circular," just collapses. People can explain it. They've published those explanations in dull paywalled journals that never make it into YouTube thumbnails. Same with some of the most popular fringe claims. Meteor impact? That was an early idea, and it's intuitive. Big circle must be a crater. But impact structures have diagnostic features. Shocked quartz, shatter cones, characteristic melt rocks, specific gravity anomalies. Richat just doesn't have those in the way a true crater does. Multiple studies have gone looking. The evidence doesn't line up. The consensus now is not an impact. Alien megastructure? There's no trace of non-natural materials, no anomalous alloys, no straight-edged machined components buried under the sand. The looks-engineered argument falls apart as soon as you realize Earth's crust is full of things that look engineered when you only half understand geology. Lost high-tech city carved in stone? Again, the rings themselves are bedrock units dipping slightly outward. They're not poured walls or cut blocks. Their ages are in the hundreds of millions of years, long before mammals like us were even a concept. Those layers were already sitting there, being slowly bent and chewed on by plate tectonics and weather. So what does "nobody can explain why" actually point to? Mostly, it's the grey zones, the parts of the story that are complicated, technical, or just not fully resolved in the public imagination. The formation mechanism of Richat in broad strokes is clear, but the fine print is still debated. Exactly when did the main uplift happen? Was it a single event, or a series of pulses spread out over geological time? How much did deep-seated magmatism contribute versus regional tectonic stresses? How quickly did each ring erode relative to its neighbours? And how did changing climate regimes tweak that process? You'll find different models, refinements, and ongoing arguments about those details. That's normal. That's what active science looks like. It's not "nobody can explain why," it's "we mostly know the story, but we're still arguing about the chapter breaks." Then there's the piece that really matters for the Atlantis discussion. Water. Here things do get legitimately complex. We know the Sahara hasn't always been a desert. There were green Sahara periods when rainfall was much higher. Lakes dotted the landscape. Rivers flowed where today there's only sand and stone. We know there were paler lakes and wetlands in parts of Mauritania, and that drainage systems have shifted over time. But reconstructing exactly how water moved in and around Richat during each humid phase, that's hard. You're trying to infer old rivers and basins from patchy sediment cores, scattered shoreline deposits, buried channels, and satellite imagery that only sees the uppermost layers. Could there have been a seasonal lake near Richat at some points? Possibly, could local springs and groundwater have made the immediate area more habitable during wet phases? also possible? Was the structure ever a coastal harbour, with the ocean lapping at those inner rings in the time frame of human civilization? So far, the answer from the evidence is very unlikely. Sea level histories, regional uplift rates, and the absence of clear marine sediments inside the structure all point away from a true seaport scenario. But hydrology at finer scales, where exactly water pooled, how long bodies of water persisted, whether there were marshes or shallow basins, is still a live research area. Those are the kinds of questions that get flattened into nobody knows in popular media. In reality, it's more often specialists have a decent working model, but the data are messy, the margins of error are wide, and the explanation doesn't fit into a clickbait sentence. That gap between what's actually unknown and what the audience has never heard an answer for is where mystery narratives thrive. If you've never read a sedimentology paper, then geologists disagree about the timing of exhumation and erosion phases sounds exactly like they're baffled. If you've never seen a geologic cross-section, the ring arrangement arises from differential erosion of gently dipping strata around a central uplift. Translates emotionally to, wow, it's a perfect target symbol in the sand. So when someone online says, look at this structure, nobody can explain why it looks just like Plato's city. What they usually mean is, nobody has fully reconciled every layer of Richat's geological history, its paleohydrology, and a 2,400-year-old philosophical allegory into one neat story that satisfies every curiosity. Which is true, but that's a much narrower, less magical claim than science is stumped, anything goes. And yet, this is where the wonder sneaks back in. Because mostly explained doesn't mean boring. Knowing that Richat's rings are the scar tissue of ancient tectonic forces and unimaginable ages of erosion doesn't make it less awe-inspiring. It makes it more so. You're looking at a landscape that records hundreds of millions of years of Earth history in a single, bizarre, almost hypnotic pattern. You're looking at something that has survived entire mountain ranges rising and falling, oceans advancing and retreating, climates flipping from swamp to desert and back again. The fact that we can read even part of that story from rock layers, mineral grains and satellite pixels is its own kind of magic. And the fact that some chapters are still fuzzy, the exact pulses of uplift, the precise paths of vanished rivers, the local climate in one specific basin, during one specific humid interval, that's not a failure. That's the frontier. That's the narrow band where explained enough to rule out Atlantis harbours overlaps with mysterious enough to keep professionals and amateurs arguing for years. The trick is learning to live in that band, to hold on to the chill that Richat gives you when you first see it, without immediately leaping to Alien City the moment an expert says, we're still working out the details. And if Richat sits in that grey zone between myth and mapped geology, so does the bigger question we've been circling around from the start. If this isn't literally Atlantis, could it still have something to do with how the Atlantis story was born? There are at least 3 ways to answer that without collapsing into definitely yes or definitely no. Call them the 3 middle paths: inspiration, coincidence, and misread text. First, inspiration. Imagine you're not Plato. You're a trader or a storyteller, or a priest in North Africa or Egypt, 1,000, 2,000 years before him. You don't have Google Earth, but you do have caravans, sailors, and thousands of years of people wandering around this continent, getting lost, finding strange things, and talking about them around fires. Somewhere far to the west, out in lands most people will never see, there's this massive circular formation. Maybe during a wetter phase it has a lake in or near it. Maybe it's just a bizarre ringed plateau standing over the plain. You, personally, never go there, but someone's cousin's cousin did, or an envoy of a king did, or a captured nomad did, and the memory of that bullseye in the desert starts circulating as a bit of geographic lore, not a detailed topographic map, just a story fragment. There is a land ringed like a target, with hills around a flat interior. There is a place where the rock itself makes circles. Then, over centuries, that fragment gets glued to other fragments. Tales of wealthy coastal peoples destroyed by floods. Half-remembered Bronze Age seafaring cultures that rose and fell around the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Political morality plays about hubris, greed, and divine retribution. By the time all of that finally trickles down to Plato, he's not getting a National Geographic field report. He's getting a mythic soup that may or may not have a distorted memory of a real landform faintly shimmering at the bottom. In that scenario, Richat doesn't have to be a city. It doesn't have to have walls, canals, or docks. It just has to be visually and conceptually weird enough for some traveller to go, "I saw something out there I've never seen anywhere else." Giant stone rings, one inside another. That's all it takes for a landscape to become raw material for legends. The strength of this inspiration idea is that it matches how human storytelling actually works. We anchor our myths to striking features of the real world all the time. Sacred mountains, bottomless lakes, caves that become gates to the underworld. The weakness: there's no direct chain of custody. No ancient text says, the Egyptians knew of a ringed land in far Mauritania and told Solon about it. It's plausible, not provable. Second path: coincidence. Strip the emotion out of it for a second and do a cold audit. What actually lines up between Plato's city and Richat? Rings. Yes. Both have concentric circles, but Plato's are precise water and land bands with given measurements. Richat's are uneven erosion rings made of bedrock. Mountains to the north, the Richat region does have higher ground there. But Plato describes them as the most beautiful and rich mountains in the world, thickly forested and full of rivers. That's not what we see in late Holocene Mauritania. A great plain to the south, there is a broad, gently sloping area south of Richat. That's a decent fit in terms of shape and relative position, but its size and orientation don't match Plato's dimensions cleanly, and there's no sign of an enormous, geometrically laid out agricultural plain from the right time period. Near the sea? That's where it really starts to wobble. Richat is far inland. Making it a literal seaport within the last 12,000 years requires heroic adjustments to sea level, crustal movement, and basic geography that the evidence just doesn't support. Date of destruction. Plato gives a clear mythical date, 9,000 years before Solon. That doesn't line up with any known catastrophic event at Richat tied to a complex civilization. The geology there doesn't show a sudden late Stone Age wipeout of a bustling harbour city. Once you lay the correspondences out like that, a third possibility emerges. Maybe we're just very good at pattern matching. Humans are experts at seeing shapes in clouds, faces in rock formations, destiny in coincidences. You give our brains a round thing in the desert and a story about round canals in a lost city, and they will snap together whether or not the underlying data really fit. That doesn't mean everything about Richat is meaningless. It means some of the parallels might be more about how our minds work than how the past actually unfolded. Which brings us to the third path: misread text. Plato was not writing an engineering report. He was writing philosophical dialogues in which characters debate ethics, politics, and the nature of the ideal state. Atlantis is the stage set for those arguments. It is entirely possible that a lot of the matches to Richat are the result of reading a flexible rhetorical text as if it were a GPS-encoded survey document. When Plato says, "beyond the Pillars of Heracles," is he always talking about exactly the same geographic boundary that later authors assumed? When he gives measurements, are those meant as literal, or as dramatic exaggerations to communicate scale and grandeur. When he talks about an island, does he mean island in our modern, strictly oceanic sense, or something more like a distinct cultural and political unit separated by marshes and channels? If we're even slightly off in how we translate and interpret those phrases, our whole map of Atlantis can shift by hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Suddenly, a structure that seems like an eerie match might just be an accidental overlap created by generous reading and a lot of rounding error. The strength of the misread text approach is that it reminds us Plato was doing philosophy, not geology. The weakness is that if you loosen the text too much, you can force fit it to almost anything: Richat, Spain, Antarctica, Mars. So where does that leave us? Somewhere in a triangle. In one corner, Richat as a distant visual or geographic inspiration that trickled into a long-lived oral tradition. In another, Richat as a spectacular but ultimately unrelated coincidence that our pattern-hungry brains can't resist linking to Atlantis. In the third, Richat as a mirror reflecting our own interpretive mistakes about what Plato was actually doing. You don't have to pick one and tattoo it on your worldview. You can say, I don't know which, and it might be a blend of all three. But it's still worth asking better questions, because holding uncertainty doesn't mean backing away from the mystery. It means engaging it more honestly. Instead of deciding in advance that Richat must be Atlantis or that Atlantis must be total fiction, you can park yourself in that uncomfortable, productive middle zone. If this story is a mosaic, what are the real stones it might be built from, and which ones have we invented? And if Richat is one of those stones, even as a misunderstood, overhyped, or only partly relevant piece, then the next logical step is to zoom out. What other real places, real disasters, and real cultures might have fed into the Atlantis myth? That's where we're headed next. When you zoom out like that, something interesting starts to happen. Atlantis stops looking like a one-off oddity and starts looking like one tile in a much bigger pattern, because cultures all over the world keep doing some version of this same thing. Take a striking landscape feature or a half-remembered disaster, mix it with moral lessons about pride and punishment, add a dash of political propaganda, let it simmer in oral tradition for a few centuries, and you get these hybrid stories that sit right on the fault line between history and myth. Atlantis is one of them, but so is the biblical flood, which seems to echo real post-Ice Age sea level rise and local catastrophes in Mesopotamia. So is the story of the city of Ys in Brittany, supposedly swallowed by the Atlantic when its gates were left open. So are the submerged palaces off the coast of India and Japan, which might be erosional rock formations, might be ancient quarries, might be ritual sites, and end up framed as the remains of forgotten kingdoms. We keep telling ourselves versions of the same narrative. There was once a powerful, wealthy, maybe arrogant civilization that lived in a special place, and in a single stroke of divine anger, cosmic bad luck, or natural violence, it vanished. The names change, the coordinates change, the emotional structure doesn't, and Richat fits into that pattern almost too perfectly. A giant target in the sand, a philosopher's story about a ringed city that angered the gods. A continent-sized desert we barely understood until a few decades ago. Satellite imagery arrives, YouTube arrives, and suddenly the Bullseye in the Sahara gets grafted onto a 2,400-year-old dialogue from Athens. Is that a coincidence? A rediscovery of a real memory? Or just the latest example of our brains doing what they always do, using the most dramatic landscape they can find as a backdrop for the oldest stories we have? If you're into that broader pattern, the way myths, ruins, and weird geology fuse into persistent question marks, I've actually pulled together 12 of the best cases we know of into a single book. Lost cities, anomalous structures, texts that don't quite line up with the ground we can dig. You can grab it on the website linked in the description, and there's a discount running this week if you want to go deeper after this video. But let's keep our focus, because the real value of putting Richat in that bigger pattern isn't to sell you on more mysteries. It's to give us a better lens for this one. Once you realise how common these catastrophic lost world narratives are, it forces a harder question. What should we actually believe about Richat and Atlantis right now? Not what would be coolest, not what gets the most clicks, but what belief can survive contact with geology, archaeology, history and human psychology at the same time. On one end of the spectrum you have Richat is literally Atlantis. Plato was basically describing this exact structure. The ring city was here. On the other end you have this is all nonsense. Atlantis is pure allegory. Richat is just an eroded dome, end of story. Neither extreme really fits the data. The literal match camp runs straight into the problems we've already hit. Inland location, time period mismatch, lack of ruins, lack of catastrophic destruction at the right date. The pure allegory camp has to ignore how often myths end up anchored to real coastlines, real floods, real political collapses, real trade networks that actually did stretch out into the Atlantic. So the live question, the one worth staying with, is narrower and trickier. Given what we have right now, Plato's text, satellite imagery of Richat, limited archaeological work in the area, and a lot of global parallels, what is the most reasonable provisional stance to take? Is it more honest to say, Richat almost certainly isn't the literal city of Atlantis, but it might be the kind of place that fed the myth machine, or Richat is just one of countless round landforms on Earth, and the connection only exists in our heads? Or we don't yet know enough about prehistoric Northwest Africa to rule out stranger scenarios, but extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence, and we don't have that evidence yet? Before we can answer that, we need a way to sort through all the noise. Because right now, the conversation around Richat is a tangle of aerial photos, enthusiastic speculation, geological jargon, half-quoted Plato, and a lot of nobody can explain this rhetoric. We need something simpler, a kind of filter. If we're going to evaluate the Richat-as-Atlantis idea fairly, we need clear criteria. Not vibes, not wishful thinking tests. Questions like, what specific archaeological signatures would a Bronze Age or earlier port city-state leave behind, even after massive erosion? How close would the geology and paleoclimate of the region have to be to Plato's description for us to call it a serious candidate? What kind of textual match counts as good enough when you're dealing with a story written thousands of years after the supposed events? And crucially, what would falsify the Richat theory? What finds or non-finds would force even its biggest fans to say, okay, this can't be it? Those are the evaluation tools we're going to need if we want to step out of the fog of looks kind of similar and into something more disciplined. So, in the next part, let's do exactly that. Let's set up a simple checklist, a few hard questions, and then run Richat through it, point by point, not to kill the mystery, but to see what survives when we stop asking, could it be Atlantis? And start asking, what would it actually take for this to be true? So after all of that, where does Richat actually land on our checklist? Let's be generous first. Let's imagine you're in the strongest possible pro-Richat camp. What's your best case? You start with the obvious, the shape. From orbit, the Richat structure looks uncannily like what a casual reader imagines when they hear Plato's description. A central island, surrounded by alternating rings of land and water, with a broad plain stretching away to one side and higher ground around the rest. You don't have to squint. You don't need to rotate the map upside down. It's a big multi-ring bullseye in roughly the right part of the world. Most other Atlantis candidates require serious imaginative gymnastics. If you ignore these parts of the text and flip the directions and assume this bay used to be a ring, Richat, by contrast, is visually simple. You show someone Plato's ringed city passage, then show them a satellite photo of Richat, and their brain does the rest. Then you add paleoclimate. We know the Sahara hasn't always been an ocean of sand. Repeated wet phases turned huge swaths of it into a green landscape with lakes, rivers, and even big inland seas. The region around Richat shows evidence of past waterways, lakes, and a more hospitable environment. So, a pro-Richat case says, sure, today it's 500 kilometers from the Atlantic and bone dry. 10,000, 20,000 years ago, that's not the picture. It could have been lush, crisscrossed with rivers, integrated into a broader Atlantic-facing ecosystem. Now fold in the regional geography. Plato talks about a great plain, surrounded by mountains open to the sea on one side. Look at northwest Africa from above. You've got the Atlas Range to the north, highlands and escarpments framing parts of the Mauritanian interior, and broad lowlands that, under different sea levels and rainfall patterns, could plausibly feel like a great plain feeding out toward the Atlantic. A motivated interpreter can sketch a line from the Atlas down through Mauritania and say, here's your mountainous backdrop, here's your plain, here's your Atlantic access back when sea level and river systems were different. The Pillars of Heracles might not mean modern Gibraltar. It could be a looser concept referring to any significant Atlantic gateway. Shift that, and suddenly, beyond the Pillars, might accommodate a northwest African power that controlled maritime routes along the coast. Put all that together, and the pro-Richat argument sounds like this. You have a naturally ringed landform that looks bizarrely like Plato's city. You have a region that was wetter, greener, and more habitable at multiple times in prehistory. You have a plausible giant plain nearby and mountain systems that kind of fit his setup. You have a culture hero, Solon, who allegedly got the story from Egyptian priests, whose own records may have included garbled memories of Western peoples and Atlantic coasts. Maybe, the argument goes, Plato's tale is an overgrown echo of some very old knowledge about a powerful culture in or around this striking landmark in a then greener Sahara. And what are the odds that such a perfect ring just happens to exist almost exactly where an Atlantic superstate is supposed to be? That's the steel-manned version. Now, the hard part. What does the best counter-argument look like when it's also being as fair as possible? It starts by taking the ring shape away as a mystery. To a geologist, Richat is a textbook example of an eroded dome, layers of rock pushed up long ago, then worn down at different rates so that resistant layers form circular ridges. The rings aren't precision-engineered canals. They're what you expect when you have domed, layered rock and millions of years of wind and water. There are other concentric features on Earth. They just aren't as big, as clean, or as nicely framed by sand. If the rings can be explained as ordinary geology, you no longer get to treat them as evidence of a lost urban engineering project. They become, at best, a cool coincidence with our story template. Then you hit the archaeological vacuum. If Richat hosted anything like the city Plato describes, a capital with temples, palaces, harbours, a big population, complex infrastructure, you'd expect a dense archaeological footprint. Stone foundations, harbour works, worked metal, trash layers. Even if buildings were made of mud brick and wood and most of it eroded away, a city that supposedly dominated the Western Mediterranean isn't going to vanish without a trace. So far, surveys around Richat have turned up scattered stone tools, simple structures, and evidence of human presence over long periods. That's normal for a landscape used by different groups in different eras. What's missing is an unmistakable urban signal. Not one carved column. Not one monumental foundation. Not one concentrated layer that screams major city at any plausible Atlantis date. Counterargument number 3, the sea problem. Whatever beyond the pillars means, Plato is extremely clear that Atlantis was a maritime power, operating in the true ocean, with fleets that could sail from their island to both the Mediterranean and other lands. Richat is way inland. Even in the wettest Saharan phases we know of, you'd have to posit enormous, now vanished river systems or inland seas that rival small oceans, plus some kind of navigable connection to the Atlantic, big enough to support a thalassocracy. Could there have been large lakes and rivers? Yes. Could there have been a navigable ribbon of water all the way from a Richat-centered culture to the open Atlantic, large and stable enough to support an empire of many islands? That's a much bigger stretch right now. There is no concrete geomorphological evidence for that kind of system centered on Richat at the right time. And then the chronology cliff. Plato's Egyptian priests talk about Atlantis falling 9,000 years before Solon, so roughly 9,600 BCE. Even if you generously suppose that number is inflated by some symbolic factor, you're still talking about either a very early complex culture during the late Ice Age, early Holocene, which would be extraordinary and would need extraordinary proof, or a story that telescopes multiple, much later Bronze Age events back into a mythic deep past. Geology dates Richat's formation to tens of millions of years ago. Its erosion pattern suggests it was already an old, worn landscape long before anything like an Ice Age civilization could have occupied it. And the archaeological record for northwest Africa, as we currently understand it, doesn't show anything like a palace and fleet superstate on that timescale. So you have a place that's the wrong age geologically, wrongly positioned for a naval power, and so far archaeologically quiet where it would need to be deafening. Given that, what kind of evidence would actually move the needle? On the maybe it really was important side, you'd want clear, stratified archaeological remains of a complex settlement in or immediately around Richat, multiple building phases, public architecture, large-scale water management, industrial activity. Independent dating, radiocarbon, optically stimulated luminescence, whatever, placing that complex phase in a window that at least plausibly lines up with the kind of late Pleistocene or early Holocene horizon the Atlantis story gestures at. Evidence of long-distance connections, non-local stone, metals or trade goods that tie Richat to Mediterranean or Atlantic coastal networks. Geomorphological data showing a robust, sustained water system capable of supporting large populations and ideally navigation, old shorelines, deltas, channels with preserved sediments. On the "this really isn't it" side, more of what we already have, but clearer. Intensive surveys and excavations across the rings and surrounding plain that continue to show only scattered, small-scale human activity, with no sign of urban density at any relevant date. Better mapping of ancient river systems demonstrating that yes, there was water and life here, but not the kind of deep channels and basins you'd need for an inland maritime capital. More precise cross-dating of Plato's sources showing that his Atlantis narrative is best explained as a remix of known Bronze Age, Aegean and Near Eastern events, making any direct tie to a specific Saharan feature increasingly unnecessary. In other words, the case is not going to turn on one artifact or one satellite photo. It will turn on patterns, layers, convergences. So where does that leave a reasonable person right now? Probably here. Richat is a striking, naturally ringed landform in a region that has shifted dramatically between green and desert over time. It's compelling as a visual match for Plato's imagination. It might someday prove to sit within a broader prehistoric landscape story we only dimly grasp. But as a literal one-to-one match for Atlantis, a powerful island city with fleets in the open Atlantic, destroyed in a single night, Richat fails too many tests. Geology explains its shape. Archaeology has not yet revealed the kind of city we'd need. The sea access and the timeline both demand speculative leaps that aren't backed by hard evidence. That doesn't mean we close the book. It means we label the spine correctly. Richat, fascinating geology, tantalizing what-ifs, low current probability as Plato's Atlantis, worth better fieldwork. If we can hold that kind of middle position, curious without being credulous, skeptical without being dismissive, then the mystery does what it's supposed to do. It doesn't just entertain us. It sharpens how we think about evidence, stories, and the deep, messy past we're still trying to map. And with that frame in place, we can finally step back and ask the last, bigger question. After everything we've learned from this Sahara Bullseye, what do we actually know? What do we honestly not know? And what should we be watching for next? Here's the cleanest way to sum it up. What we know is solid. Plato's text is a philosophical story, framed as history, built around moral lessons about hubris, ideal states, and the rise and fall of powers. It has some concrete geographical and numerical claims, but it's not a neutral field report. It's a crafted narrative. We also know what Richat is. Geologically speaking, a deeply eroded, uplifted dome, tens of millions of years old, with concentric layers exposed by time, not bulldozers. Its rings are what rock does under pressure and erosion, not what engineers do with shovels and surveyors. We know the Sahara has swung between green and desert many times. Lakes, rivers, wetlands, and habitable corridors absolutely existed. People lived there, hunted there, moved through there. The region around Richat was part of that living landscape, and we know that, so far, archaeology around Richat has not turned up anything like a dense, monumental seafaring capital. No ports, no palaces, no massive public works, human presence, yes. An Atlantean supercity, no. What we don't know is where the edges of those facts blur into something more interesting. We don't know how much of Plato's Atlantis story, if any, preserves real memories of specific places or disasters, versus being a collage of different events or pure invention with a coating of Egyptian prestige. We don't know whether Northwest Africa, and maybe even the broader Sahara, fed into that collage in ways we haven't yet traced. We don't know the full prehistoric human story of the Mauritanian interior. There are gaps in the survey data. There are dunes no one has yet bothered to core. There are likely sites sitting a metre below the surface that no camera on Google Earth will ever reveal. And we definitely don't know what the next 20 years of fieldwork, remote sensing and paleoclimate reconstruction are going to show us. New LIDAR campaigns, better dating of ancient shorelines, more systematic digs around Saharan oases like Richat, those are the things to watch. If future work finds a complex water-managed settlement near Richat at the right time, with long-distance links to the Atlantic, the conversation changes. If, instead, it keeps coming up as a lightly used landmark in a broader nomadic landscape, that picture hardens too. In the meantime, curiosity is allowed. Just keep the word maybe close at hand. Now I want to hear from you. Given everything we've walked through, the text, the rocks, the climate, the gaps, where do you land? Is Richat your leading candidate, an interesting long shot, or just a beautiful coincidence? And where are you listening from? Drop your take and your location in the comments. I read as many as I can, and the range of perspectives is half the fun. If you found this deep dive useful, hit like so more people actually see it, and subscribe if you want more long-form archaeology and deep-time mysteries without the cheap clickbait. Turn on notifications if you don't trust the algorithm to remember you exist. And if you want to go further down this rabbit hole, I've put together a book on 12 prehistoric secrets that almost rewrote what we thought we knew about ancient humanity. It's available through the site, link is in the description. That's where I can say all the things that don't fit in a single video. For now, thanks for thinking this through carefully. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next mystery.